Welcome to the April 5th, 2021 meeting of the Arlington County Planning Commission. I'm Jim Lantelmi. I'm chair of the commission. The Planning Commission advises the county board on matters pertaining to planning and development in our community. This is the first of two evenings scheduled for our public hearings. Tonight, we'll be hearing a presentation on the county's proposed Vision Zero Transportation Safety Plan. We'll have consideration of a recommendation to change the Arlington County zoning ordinances sections 12.37 and 15.5.9 to modify the height limits in RA zones 14-26, 8-18, and 6-15 to allow 60 additional feet for 100% affordable projects, or less than 100% if found by the county board that project consistent with the affordable housing master plan. And finally, consideration of a recommendation to designate a historic district overlay under the zoning ordinance sections 11.3 for 7.3 acres of the site known as the February Lothrop Estate on Wilson Boulevard. I apologize for not having a video. My video went out about 1 minute before this started. Trying to figure out how to fix it, but for now, I'll just be on audio. At our Wednesday, April 7th meeting, we will hear two items. The first will be amendments to the Arlington County Zoning Ordinance Article 11.1 Columbia Pike Neighborhoods Form-Based Code District to allow architectural and site modifications to 2400 Columbia Pike in the C2 zoning district, and a request under site plan number 445 to allow the temporary conversion of 100 residential units to hotel use and a change in the project's parking ratio. If you're here for those items, note that they will not be discussed tonight. There are some items that I'm required to share with you now. For the safety of our staff and residents, we're holding this meeting virtually as we have since our July 2020 hearing. Welcome to our commissioners, county staff, applicants, and community members who are all joining us remotely. We're legally authorized to hold this virtual meeting based on the governor's executive orders, legislation adopted by the Virginia General Assembly, and the county board's continuity of operations ordinance adopted in March 2020. Before we begin, I have a few specifics to orient all of us to our virtual environment. Tonight's meeting is available as a broadcast with closed captioning on Comcast Xfinity channels 25 and 1085, on Verizon Fios channels 39 and 40, and the county's website. Audio of tonight's meeting is available via phone. If commissioners, presenters, or speakers lose internet connectivity during today's meeting, please reconnect with us by phone. You can use the number provided in the team's invite, which is 1-347-973-6905, with a conference ID of 416-405-996#. And the registered speakers have received Ms. Johnson's telephone number in their speaker registration confirmations. As for other presenters and speakers joining us through Microsoft Teams, please keep your phones and other devices muted until you're called upon. Please turn off sound to any other devices around you to minimize interference. When called upon to speak, you must unmute yourself by clicking on the microphone icon that's located on your meeting's command bar. The moderator does not have the ability to unmute you. Only you can do that. If you're dialing in by phone, press *6 to unmute. Commissioners, if you wish to be recognized to speak, as always, please use your hand raise function or turn on your video and unmute your microphone to signal your interest, and I'll call upon you in order. Public speakers, you will be called upon by the clerk at an assigned time. Pre-registration to speak at tonight's hearing was required. We are not able to accommodate additional speakers. Public comment will take place within the same timeframes as we would otherwise provide at an in-person meeting. The speakers will have 3 minutes to comment as individuals and 5 minutes to speak if representing an organization. Your speaking time will be displayed on the screen by the clerk, but if you're dialing in by phone and unable to see the screen, we'll provide an audible warning when 30 seconds are remaining. You'll be muted when your time is concluded. The meeting chat is active for presenters or commissioners only, and only if they need technical assistance. Do not use the meeting chat for discussions, public comments, questions about agenda items, or requests for more information. All the public comments must be shared verbally for the record during the assigned public testimony period. Finally, this is a public forum. Tonight's meeting will be recorded and posted to the county's website, and all information associated with tonight's meeting, whether written or spoken, is subject to the Virginia Freedom of Information requirements. We're now on to our agenda items, and Madam Clerk, please call the first item.
Thank you. Our first item for the evening, as spoken, is the Vision Zero Transportation Safety Program. This is an informational item only, which will only be presented by the staff. We have Christine Baker to present this item to us this evening.
Welcome, Ms. Baker. The screen is yours, and your Vision Zero is up on the screen now.
Wonderful. Thank you so much. I'm Christine Baker. I'm with Transportation Engineering and Operations, and I'm joined by my colleague, Hui Wong, who is the Transportation Engineering and Operations Bureau Chief. And we're very excited to share our Vision Zero action plan with you tonight. For those of you who are not familiar, Vision Zero is a strategy to eliminate all transportation-related fatalities and severe injuries, while we also ensure a safe, healthy, and equitable mobility for all people in Arlington. So Arlington averages about 55 severe and 4 fatal crashes per year, and our target is to get to 0 fatal or severe crashes by 2030. We've always prioritized safety for all modes of transportation in Arlington, but by adopting Vision Zero, we're taking a different approach to making our streets and our trails safer by creating key safety target areas and taking actions towards those priorities. This plan commits to immediate and effective actions to help us reduce severe crashes and also bring us closer to the transportation safety goals. Staff from Arlington County's various departments came together in this effort to tackle safety issues through a multidisciplinary approach. And then we've also had lots of stakeholders representing a diverse array of interests and communities involved. So I'll also give James Schroll a shout out. Thank you for being our Planning Commission representative to the external Vision Zero stakeholders group. It's been a pleasure working with James, and he's been representing the interests of planning and that perspective as it pertains to transportation safety. So tonight we'll run through briefly how we developed the action plan, and we used findings from stakeholder input, from our public engagement efforts, and from data analysis to develop safety targets and action items that we've identified that have guided our program. And then we'll talk about how we'll track our performance measures and report out to the community on our progress over time. And we'll have time, I think, at the end for questions. Maybe I'll let Giselle determine that. So looking at our timeline, the county board adopted a Vision Zero resolution in summer 2019 to create this action plan. So we spent the last year and a half working with staff, stakeholders, and the community. And we're currently finalizing the plan and preparing it to go to the board for adoption in May. So the final plan is not yet released, but it will be within the next week. And we are coming here asking for your support as we ask the county board to adopt this 5-year plan. The external stakeholders group, comprised of representatives from over 25 community groups, attended bi-monthly meetings as we created this plan, and they provided insights and feedback throughout the process. Again, thanks to James Schroll for representing the Planning Commission. And then in addition to external stakeholders, we had an interdepartmental group that met monthly that brought in staff from all different departments within the county, which helped us to address safety from the different disciplines and perspectives and really break down silos to make progress towards transportation safety. We also had 3 phases of public engagement, and that focused on setting program goals in early 2020 as we first started the process, then identifying safety concerns in the fall of last year, and then finally we gathered feedback on our draft plan in early 2021. And so we've really appreciated the high level of engagement that we've had from the community in the process, and it's been a lot of valuable input that we've received along the way and woven into our plan to make sure that it really truly addresses our community's concerns. So we've used the goals in the master transportation plan to help us shape the Vision Zero safety program goals. And then the community helped by vetting these goals in early 2020, as I mentioned. And these were the final resulting program goals for Vision Zero. And that is that our Vision Zero program will be multimodal, so ensure safety no matter how someone chooses to get around. It'll put safety first in all our projects, programs, policies. It'll be transparent and accountable, so we'll make sure we are following up on everything we say we're going to do. It will be data driven, so using data to help us make informed decisions. It'll be collaborative, again, multidisciplinary, really broad reaching, so we create safety for everyone, and equitable. We want to prioritize transportation safety, especially with our most vulnerable communities. So when we talk to the community about safety challenges in the fall, issues like speeding and aggressive driving, distracted users or people not paying attention, unsafe conditions at intersections or driveways, and unsafe pedestrian or bicycle crossings were some of the top challenges that people reported in the online forum. And then also in that clickable map that we hosted, you can see a screenshot of it in the upper right-hand corner. So it was great to learn about what people perceive as their main challenges as they try to navigate the transportation system. And then in addition to hearing about safety issues from the community, we also use data to drive the planning effort. So we focused analysis on severe and fatal crashes. And we learned that while crashes involving a pedestrian make up only about 5% of all crashes, pedestrian crashes were almost a quarter of our critical crashes. So that's a crash that ended in a severe or fatal outcome, and over half of our fatal crashes. Similarly, motorcycles made up only less than 2% of all crashes, but then over 13% of our serious crashes. And bicycles only made up about 3% of all reported crashes, but 8% of serious crashes. So it's important that our Vision Zero program focuses on these vulnerable user groups like pedestrians and bicycles and motorcyclists, because they're more likely to sustain a serious injury in the event of a crash. We also isolated severe and fatal crashes to look at circumstantial factors that were common across those crashes. Only about 8% of all crashes involved alcohol, but almost half of our fatal crashes involved alcohol. So that shows that drinking and driving has a large impact on the severity of a crash. While there were fewer people on the road at night, we saw that over half of our fatal crashes occurred in dark conditions. And speeding and turning also played a role in over a quarter of our severe crashes. So all this information really helps us to understand where to prioritize our efforts in reducing severe crashes. We also mapped serious and fatal injury crashes around the county, and based on the locations of those critical crashes, we identified what a Vision Zero safety professional calls the high injury network, and that highlights corridors with high concentrations of severe or fatal crashes. And if you want to see a close-up version of this map, you can go onto the Vision Zero website. We've labeled the corridors, but you can see it's a mix of some of our higher speed facilities and highways, as well as some local roads, especially in very busy corridors. And then we also, in addition to the high injury network, mapped our data to identify common locations where critical crashes were reported. So, for example, there were a lot of left turn related crashes on Glebe Road. Another example are bike crashes in the Clarendon area, and crashes that occurred at night along 4 Mile Run. So by looking at these types of conditions that resulted in clusters of certain types of crashes, we can make preemptive or systemic changes to our transportation network that help us to prevent them in the future. So using the crash analysis findings that we just talked about, as well as the stakeholder and community engagement, we identified these key safety target areas where we have to focus our efforts to reduce our serious injuries and fatalities. That's intersections, pedestrians, bicycles, alcohol, speed, distraction, work zones, our high injury network corridors, equity, information quality, safety culture, and transparency and accountability. And those last 4 points are really things that came out of the public engagement effort, and they're a little bit more qualitatively focused. But focusing on these target areas altogether, we're going to work towards safe transportation for everyone, regardless of how they choose to get around. And then we created these action items, and each of these action items addresses at least one of the target areas that I mentioned on the last slide. So these actions lay out a roadmap to reduce severe and fatal crashes by A, improving data and analysis techniques to identify our safety issues. B, improving processes in departmental organization, and that's going to help us prioritize safety in all of our plans and our programs, our policies, and our projects. C, engaging with community members to understand those safety issues that we're seeing on the ground. And then D, fostering partnerships with the people that will help us create a community culture of safety throughout Arlington. And I'll just highlight, how does the Planning Commission, or how does planning relate to this transportation safety program? And, when you look at item A4 on equity analysis, that really is going to help us achieve our equity goals, which I think span all disciplines, by developing maps of equity indicators and overlaying that with crash data and our other transportation data to identify more clearly how transportation safety relates to areas of disparity, and also how we can start to close those gaps in access to safe transportation. Item B1, master planning, is also very directly related to the Planning Commission's activities. We're suggesting to begin an MTP update with all modal elements combined that recognizes the Vision Zero program and principles and integrates that into project criteria. And also integrating the principles of Vision Zero into any other planning updates. So ensuring that transportation and safety policies are incorporated into all of the county's policy and plans. And also item B2 on plan and project review. We are implementing a standard approach for including a documented safety review as part of the site plan review process. We'll also be collaborating on the planning and design of all new or improved parks and trails to ensure safe access and mobility. Another item is active construction, working as there are developments to ensure, provide guidance to enhance the safety considerations when there's construction going on, making sure people who are walking or biking are also protected. And then looking at items in our engagement column, that's creating an easy to find, use, and track place for people to go report any safety concerns on the county website, as well as community knowledge building and helping to share information, do campaigns to increase awareness of transportation safety issues. And then also in our partnerships, we have item D5, stakeholder partners, which includes the Planning Commission. And we want to have you along in the conversation as we implement this 5-year plan to know how we're doing and identify areas where there might be future partnerships or areas that we can, collaborate on in the future to, work towards this community culture and these safety goals. So we shared these action items with the public in our engagement in January, February of this year. And overall, people agreed that the actions suggested would help us reach our transportation safety goals. And we also received some constructive feedback that we used to improve the plan and ensure that the action items are all clear and effectively address our target areas. And as I mentioned, that new iteration will be out in the next week and up on the website for all to see. Now, looking at the program and how we're going to measure our success, we selected Vision Zero performance measures that will track the success of our actions in each of the target areas. So you can see they directly match up. We're going to be tracking our serious and fatal crashes, and then the number of crashes at intersections involving pedestrians, involving bicycles, involving alcohol, speed, distraction, or work zones, as well as the number of crashes on our high injury networks, the number of crashes in higher poverty or diversity areas, and then qualitatively tracking our information, our safety culture, and that transparency and accountability element. And we recognize that some areas like information quality and safety culture and transparency are more difficult to track, but we'll be actively reporting on everything we do, all of our actions and projects, and taking feedback from the community as we go. We also have a crash dashboard available on the Vision Zero website where you and other community members can freely look at crash data on a map and learn about crash types and circumstances throughout the county. And this platform is another step towards that goal of transparency. And so we don't expect to see Vision Zero change Arlington overnight, but we hope that by implementing the plan, we're instilling a community safety culture, and we'll also be starting to see these projects, see this difference on our streets and trails over time. And so this slide just shows a few examples of what Vision Zero could look like in practice: better signage, better markings, better education, more awareness in the community. So our stakeholders will remain involved as we implement the plan, and we look forward to reporting out on our progress as we implement our action items. We'll be reviewing the outcomes, and we'll be identifying and evolving our next steps. So we want to ensure that our actions are hitting on those safety targets, as we talked about earlier. We want to, create a flexible plan where we can pivot and make changes if we start to see that maybe we're not making the impact on safety that we'd hoped. We'll be publishing the annual report every year as well, with a mid-year check-in to share that progress. And since this is a 5-year plan, we'll likely start the action plan update in 2025 based on how things are going. So as I mentioned, the plan will be published by mid-April, and we're preparing for board action in May 2021. As always, we welcome feedback and ideas to help improve safety in our community. My email address is right here. And we hope that you will support us moving forward. So thank you very much for the opportunity to talk with you all tonight, and I'm happy to take questions if we have time. Thank you.
Sure. Yeah. Thank you, Ms. Baker. Yes, I appreciate your coming here and giving this presentation. I know this was heard at the Transportation Commission meeting last week. It was not an action item. I understand this is going to the county board in, are you looking at May or June?
We are targeting May.
Targeting May. So you believe this will come back to the Transportation Commission. Are you planning to bring this back to us, the Planning Commission, as an action item?
I believe we are planning to come back to the Transportation Commission, and we were not planning to come back to the Planning Commission unless you would like to have us back. But
okay, then this is our main shot to give you feedback. Yeah, yes. I think if any of our commissioners right now have any questions for Ms. Baker about the Vision Zero plan, now's the time to start raising your hand. I see none. I do have one. Commissioner Siegel, I see your hand is up. You're recognized.
Thank you. Thank you. Ms. Baker, am I correct in understanding that, and thank you for the presentation. I found it very interesting. The idea is to publish the plan, but not begin implementation steps until, did I see 2025? Is that right?
So we'll be implementing now through 2025. And since this plan, our target year to get to zero is 2030. So we have a 5-year plan to start. And then we will likely be creating another, I'm not sure what the time frame will be for the second iteration of the plan, but for the duration of the program, we'll be working towards action items. So this is our first 5-year plan, and then we'll create a next plan to enable that continuity moving forward.
Oh, I misunderstood your graph. Thank you for the clarification.
Yes. Oh,
thank you.
Thank you very much. Maybe we'll make some edits to it to make sure that's clear.
Okay, thank you, Commissioner Siegel. Commissioner Peterson.
Thank you very much. So I noticed you said about 50% of fatalities involved alcohol, and I didn't see many specific talking points about ways to target that aspect of the fatalities. And so I didn't know if you were thinking about working with the police to do more checkpoints, or if you got this plan and it's part of the partnerships aspect, but it just didn't go into the specific details about how to work through that.
Yeah, since this is a brief, if you dive into some of the action items. It's very long, so I tried to keep it brief for this presentation. But yes, it really ties into the partnerships, some of that stakeholder engagement, Virginia State Police engagement, ACPD. We're really working towards more automated enforcement, but we realize that, that's very hard to do with alcohol related. So we can, collaborate with ACPD to identify ways that we can, better educate and also enforce alcohol laws. And it really has to do with the community knowledge building as well, where we're, really trying to push campaigns and, the data really tells a story. So I think if we can show, more people what we're finding in our crashes, we're hoping that can help start to target that behavior change. So we're going to try to come from it from both the enforcement and the education, and then as well, like the encouragement and just engaging of the community to target that. So it kind of exemplifies the multidisciplinary aspect of the plan. It's a great question.
Great, thank you. And I know you mentioned equity being a priority for this project, and I know equity is something that the police department looks at and that the county board cares about. And of course, when we're looking at police enforcement, making sure that equity is something specifically that we're looking at so that there's no profiling and things like that. So we want to ensure we're lowering the fatalities without giving up some other area of importance to Arlington County. So thank you.
Definitely. Yeah, that's a priority as well.
There are other, thank you, Commissioner Peterson. Are there any other, Commissioner Schroll?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I do want to thank Ms. Baker for her presentation and for her hard work on this. Just something she mentioned, but to kind of reiterate to my colleagues, there are several components to this project that do really relate to the Planning Commission. So if you have time to go look at the action items, there are several that are kind of directly related to our work. So that B1, that master planning piece that Ms. Baker mentioned, an update to the MTP to really incorporate the Vision Zero aspects, something that will come back to us presumably as the MTP gets updated back to the LRPC and the Planning Commission more broadly. The other is action B2, helping to integrate these safety processes and standards into our site plan review process. So there will probably be some more kind of elements to come into SPRC going forward. And the other one that's pretty important is that staff's going to be developing a safety toolbox. So it's action B7. And they'll be updating that toolbox over time. So that's another opportunity for this Planning Commission and future Planning Commissions to help staff think through kind of additional tools to bring into this process to try to achieve Vision Zero. Thanks.
Thank you, Commissioner Schroll. And I also want to make sure all of us recognize your work on this on behalf of the Planning Commission to contribute to this very important and long-awaited initiative of the county. One of the things that a couple of things did come up with Transportation Commission, which I think, while the commission overall is very supportive of this, of course, what I would certainly, one thing was raised and I'd like to see maybe given a little bit of emphasis would be an overall reduction of vehicle miles traveled in the county as part of this goal. The fewer cars on the road, the fewer distance trips, the fewer opportunities there are for there being encounters between pedestrians and cars. Another would be no longer having the priority for roads be the fastest, easiest, best traffic flow. Vehicles shouldn't be the sole weight for determining traffic timing, traffic light timing, speed limits, that sort of thing. And we're clearly moving that direction, as all of us can see, as speed limits are reduced within the county. But I think it might be best if that comes up a little more clearly in the Vision Zero statements, overall philosophical statements. Anyway, that's just my comment. Are there any other commissioners who'd like to make comments tonight? Okay, thank you, Ms. Baker. We very much appreciate your coming here and giving us the background on this very important county initiative.
Thank you so much for having me, and we'll look forward. If you have any questions or other thoughts afterward, please feel free to email, and have a great night. Thanks.
Great, thank you. Good night. Madam Clerk, can you call the second item?
Sure. Item number 2 is ZOA-2021-01. We have Nick Rogers, our planning staff, to present this item. This is the Arlington County zoning ordinance development on the RA districts. Mr. Rogers, take it away.
Madam Clerk, thank you so much. Mr. Chair, members of the Planning Commission, good evening. Just wanted to check in, make sure you can hear me and that you're seeing the opening slide.
I can hear you, but the slide's not up yet.
Okay, that sounds good. Let me give that one more try, Mr. Chair.
Okay.
Okay.
It's up.
Great, great. Thank you so much. Just give me a couple moments to get myself oriented. So, Mr. Chair, thanks again for as we get set up there. We're glad to be back before you tonight. I'm here joined by Ms. Jennifer Smith as well as Mr. Richard Tucker, both from CPHD. We're presenting joint work conducted by both the Planning Division and the Housing Division on a zoning ordinance amendment that would enable the board ultimately to permit increases in building height for affordable housing projects located in 3 of the county's multifamily residential zoning districts. Now, the public hearing that you're holding tonight was authorized last month by the county board by a resolution authorizing the county manager to advertise your public hearing tonight, as well as the county boards on either April 17th or the 20th. And so I'll just share a brief overview of our multifamily zoning, a brief history on some important amendments over the years, some of the regional development trends, which inform some of staff's analysis on this work, as well as staff's recommendation and our public outreach and some of the feedback that we've received. So for those of you who have read our research compendiums for the missing middle study, or if you're just a student for Arlington's planning and zoning, you know that the county has dedicated zoning standards for different levels of multifamily development, which actually date back to as early as 1942. And these zoning standards govern a host of dimensional characteristics for multifamily development, everything from minimum lot size, maximum height, maximum dwelling units per acre, among others. And based on research that we've conducted internally, we know that the dimensional standards for our RA districts, the 3 that I have up on the viewer there, those dimensional standards have been unchanged and consistent since 1978. Much of the county's stock of garden apartments, generally constructed between the mid-1930s and mid-1960s, is zoned one of these 3 multifamily districts that are within the scope of this study. And those are RA 1426, RA 818, and RA 615. And while I mentioned how those base standards have remained consistent, previous county boards have amended different sections of the zoning ordinance over the years to help facilitate and foster the creation of more affordable housing in Arlington. We do document some of that history in the staff report. We also discussed that at length at your ZOCO meeting back in January. I do want to bring attention, though, to several changes that were made to the zoning ordinance in 2019, which resulted in a restructuring and a reorganization of the county's bonus density standards. Among other changes, the zoning ordinance's affordable housing bonus, the affordable housing bonus provisions were reconfigured to replace provisions which for many years had permitted an additional 6 stories in bonus height and 25% bonus residential density with what we refer to as quote unquote uncapped height and density. And what we mean by that is as those maximum thresholds, those maximum development standards, they through the site plan process now correspond with the maximums recommended in the development sites, the sector and area plan that a particular development site is the subject to, phase development site plan, or other county, similar county board approved policy. Now, the board's actions include several editorial changes, one of which was a clarification that site plan development in the RA districts subject to affordability regulations that were adopted in 1992 and 2001, they must adhere to those maximum heights of either 60 feet for RA 1426 and 818 or 70 feet for RA 615. So that uncapped height provision that was adopted in 2019, that was disconnected. That was the development is unable to reach those thresholds even within an adopted area or sector plan. And the distinction was drawn at the time because there were, as you saw from your staff report, the map that we showed there that you'll see in the presentation later, we have numerous RA zoned areas throughout the county that are unplanned, quote unquote, or not subject to an area sector plan. And staff had expressed caution at the time with enabling an applicant to request both uncapped density and height outside of the county's planning corridors and transit station areas. So with that caution in mind at the time, we felt that those provisions should not be carried forward for the areas outside. Without a more defined vision for the multifamily development in these areas, what we were recommending at the time was to fold further study of the RA districts outside of the planning corridors and the planned areas into the Housing Conservation District Phase 2 work and evaluate proposals for similar measures for implementation rather. With these zoning changes over the years and with the change in 2019, despite the work that the county has done to keep the zoning standards aligned with our housing needs, of course, the community continues to experience severe shortages of available housing affordable to residents who are not high income earning affluent households. And the culprits are familiar trends to this board. You've been briefed on this by staff in the past. You hear about it from county residents as well as our housing advocates. We've documented the loss of market rate affordable apartments, or MARCs, as part of the HCD work dating back in 2017. You know that back in 2000, the county had a little over 17,000 MARCs affordable to households at up to 60% of the area median income. Fast forward to 2016, we had just under 3,000 such units remaining. That's an 84% decrease over that 16-year period. And what the catalyst for that massive decrease, sometimes redevelopment, sometimes the county partnering with an affordable housing provider to convert those MARCs into our committed affordable unit supply. But oftentimes it's just rising rent and incremental increases over time that would force those dwelling units to not be affordable to folks making less than 60% of the AMI. And while that partnership over the years on a case-by-case, site-by-site basis has been helpful in incrementally increasing and preserving our affordable housing supply from the MARCs, it is not a financially feasible or sustainable solution all on its own to combat those chronic affordability issues. I will note that since the late 1970s, the county has preserved approximately 4,500 marks through loans to acquire the properties and stabilize those further rent increases. Of course, the region's economic success as a job center, continued population growth, increased job opportunities has made housing production a priority issue for our community, as well as every other jurisdiction in the Washington, D.C. metro area. And we are addressing this through a myriad of different responses through the Housing Arlington program, particularly through land use tools. We've had success with updating the zoning ordinance to enable senior living, elder care uses. You reviewed that work in late 2019. We of course have our missing middle housing study underway, and we have our we've renamed and expanded our scope of work from Housing Conservation District Phase 2 to what we're calling the Multifamily Reinvestment Study, and I'll elaborate on that in a subsequent slide. As in taking more closely at the work that's before you tonight, as those and as our longer range, more comprehensive Housing Arlington work continues, we do see a need for some near-term interim steps that we can take to respond to these trends, particularly with this work before you tonight, which was directed as an effort by the County Manager's Office. Now, within our RA areas, we do have individual sites located in transitional areas between our transit station areas and some of our lower density residential neighborhoods that could be appropriate on a case-by-case basis for increased building height. Some of these sites would benefit from land use safeguards to ensure that effective transitions between the development site and the surrounding neighborhoods are being made by the development applicant. Keep in mind that in addition, we do have some historical precedent in enabling increased building height on a case-by-case basis, and particularly 6 stories up and this dates back to the original 1972 bonus density ordinance that was carried forward throughout several decades. Now, with the bonus provisions for uncapped height are currently not enabled for the 3 RA districts, the uncapped density provision can be approved by the board through the site plan process. And on top of that, we're aware that enabling increased height for particularly our affordable housing developers would allow the county to, in the near term, to potentially avoid missed opportunities for advancing new affordable housing projects during the next year's funding and tax credit cycles. Of course, the pandemic has created disruptions in certain segments of the housing market, but we are projecting the DC metro area to continue to be a worldwide economic center, robust local economy that continues to drive that growth and that housing demand. And I mentioned earlier some of that adjustment in scope from the HCD work. And for those of you who were on the commission at that time, you'll recall that the Housing Conservation District areas, that study was focused on targeted areas that had general land use plan designations and number 1, and number 2, concentrations of marks that in combination with one another created a low-hanging fruit opportunity for actually an overall net reduction in housing through the redevelopment of an older multifamily building coming down, being replaced by townhouses, by right townhouses actually. The economic influences of our housing demand are manifesting themselves, however, not just in those targeted areas, but throughout the county and throughout all of our multifamily districts, not just in isolated areas. And so what we've taken after some reevaluation of the work after the completion of the bonus density study, what we've decided to do to expand the study, expand the scope to account for all of the areas in the county that are zoned either RA 1426, 818, or 615. And the multifamily reinvestment study is still carrying forward the HCD goals and objectives, while incorporating recommendations from other known areas of need in our zoning. And some of those, Mr. Chair, I'll just go through very quickly with you. We know that there are some redevelopment and just frankly, development and maintenance challenges that come with some of our older apartment sites dealing with zoning nonconformities, for example. We know that's an area of need. Modern development standards that reflect the development realities of Arlington today in 2021 and beyond, not the development reality of 1978. Carrying forward all of the goals and objectives from the HCD policy framework that was adopted by the board in 2017, which includes providing opportunities for affordable housing for residents at either the 60% or 80% AMI income tier. We want to be mindful of increasing the supply of multifamily housing while effectively integrating new housing within and adjacent to existing neighborhoods. And of course, development in our multifamily areas that respects our cultural heritage and resources and aligns with the community's historic preservation values. And so given those needs, staff's recommendation that's before you tonight is to amend the zoning ordinance to enable the county board to modify the maximum building height standards for the three RA districts within the study's scope. Now, there are several caveats with that modification authority that staff is recommending for the board. The first is that it would be enabled through the site plan process. So a development applicant would require site plan approval and would be required to go through the SPRC process, number one. Number two, the request can be for up to 60 feet of additional height. In many ways, it restores the provision that was enabled prior to the change in 2019. I do want to point out, Mr. Chair, that it's a request. It's a modification request. It's not an entitlement. It's not automatic. The project still needs to meet all of our conventional standards and goals and objectives and policies of good planning here in Arlington. But as the board had reviewed the RTA last month in light of community feedback that it had received, that staff had received on the amendment's countywide applicability, we did receive direction to evaluate further ways in which the language could be narrowed, particularly utilizing geography. And in taking just an additional look at the language, we saw an opportunity to more distinctly clarify that the provisions should not be conflicting with already in place planning guidance, something, again, you've heard me mention this several times tonight, within an adopted area plan or sector plan, some sort of other similar board approved policy. And what you saw in the updated staff report that was forwarded to you last week, it's available online right now, you're seeing some additional edits that we've crafted that would prohibit the increased building height provision to be utilized within a planning district as identified on the general land use plan. And so, Mr. Chair, you should be seeing the map on your screen right now. This is from attachment 2 in the staff report. And what we hope we've done in great clarity is identified in blue those planning districts on the GLUP. And planning district is a bit of an omnibus term, but what it does is in the legend on the GLUP, it corresponds to notes that signify special planning provisions, oftentimes, like I mentioned, area sector plans or other special studies that have been conducted over the years in collaboration with community stakeholders. Of course, the planning along the corridors is most notable, but we have other planning efforts that are signified in these notations, which are the main vehicle that we use to link implementation from the comprehensive plan, from a community planning effort, linking that to implementation with our zoning ordinance itself. And I've identified several more of these special planning districts on the slide and in the staff report as well. Just taking one of those as an example for you, you can see here how this is a inset capture of the GLUP focused in on Columbia Pike. You can see here how Columbia Pike's corridor, the revitalization districts are identified as planning districts on the GLUP. First with the commercial centers in number 8 there that was reflecting the planning work completed in the early and mid 2000s, and then the portions of the corridor that happened in between the commercial centers with the neighborhoods work in 2013. And in this instance, the implementation does come in the form of the form-based code. So that is one piece of response where we've made some adjustments to the recommendation, keeping it in line with other limitations and guardrails with the language. The board would need to make two findings in order to utilize this increased bonus height provision. The first is that 100% of the dwelling units provided by the applicant would need to satisfy the zoning ordinance's definition for low or moderate income housing. We do make mention of this in the staff report, but for that, what low and moderate income housing means is that for rental units, those would be affordable to residents making no more than 60% of the area median income as determined by US HUD. And for sale units, for home ownership units, 80% of the AMI. That's in the zoning ordinance. Now, we did feel a need to include some flexibility, and I know that this was a discussion both with ZOCO in January, but also with the board during the RTA last month, where we saw a need for some flexibility, where in certain corner case scenarios, the board may seek and desire to utilize this tool when a development applicant is still making a significant contribution to the county's affordable housing supply, but it doesn't meet that 100% threshold. We took some time in the staff report, and you see some of the goals and objectives in the Affordable Housing Master Plan that a development applicant could use in order to meet this finding and to make this justification in their application. The second finding, along with that affordability requirement, is that the development must show a site design and a building massing that creates effective transitions with the surrounding built environment. Again, another point of discussion, we purposely had kept that language broad to keep yourselves, members of the community, the board, and the applicant, to give a lot of flexibility, because every development site is very unique and different with its surrounding land uses, topography, other environmental factors, but did offer some examples from the toolkit that are used to create those effective transitions, things like building setbacks, step backs, open space, landscape buffers, architectural facade features, and we know that there was a lot of discussion of, well, what does that look like what does that look like here in the community? And I, in all honesty, Mr. Chair, a lot of the good examples that we see are more urban in nature, knowing that we are in. Knowing that this language could be utilized in areas that are in more transitional zones or in a farther distance away from our transit, our metro rail stations than typical. In coming up with several examples, we decided to just really focus in on Market Common, which it really shows how a redevelopment opportunity can blend itself in with a surrounding low-density, single-family detached neighborhood. Turning quickly to community engagement as we get to wrap up with the presentation today, this study is categorized as a short-term review when we're coming up with our work plan and developing these categories. You know that a short-term review is typically going to be a 6-month process, and the staff research analysis and the community engagement that we do is tied to the level of complexity and the countywide significance that would go into that designation. So We have been working on this since late fall, but we were out with mentions of this on the website, and of course, with you at ZOCO in January, as well as the Housing Commission. So we have had content posted on the study on our zoning studies page since January. We did conduct some initial outreach to interest groups, housing advocates, affordable housing developers on this work. But as word of mouth has continued on the study, we have been very active in meeting with civic leaders, civic associations who have requested further information, and we have additional outreach that is still scheduled over this week and into next as well. And that engagement has elicited a lot of feedback. We took great care and diligence in the staff report to document that. I know that's of keen interest to you and your colleagues as you're making these deliberations. I do want to point out two key areas of concern that I want you to be mindful of as you're reviewing the work. The first was, and I've mentioned this previously, as we in the run-up to the RTA, we did hear from different community stakeholders about the implications that this work could have, making potential conflicts between adopted plans and policies and an affordable housing project. Quite frankly, could this tool be utilized in a way that would create a site plan development that would not honor and respect and align with the recommendations of an area plan or a sector plan? I've already discussed how we've made some adjustments where we feel that the language is now more responsive to that feedback. And then we've also been engaging with one of the biggest studies that we have going on right now, the Plan Lee Highway Community Forum. And so just if I may, Mr. Chair, with the Plan Lee Highway process, that community planning process that begun in 2018, the ultimate goal is that the community will be developing a comprehensive vision and policy framework for transforming the Lee Highway corridor into a Main Street community. And we've been coordinating closely with the Lee Highway Alliance, as well as Ms. Alfonso Ahmed on staff, the project manager. And we just want to be very clear and emphatic that that the land use scenario concept, the preliminary concept that's going to develop that, and the final recommendations that come out of that study over the course of the next year, that is going to be the prevailing vision for controlling and that the development community will need to meet once that plan and policy is wrapped up. So we have been approached, and we are aware of some affordable housing projects that in the near term would seek to benefit from this increase in building height. We feel very confident that none of them are along Lee Highway. I know that members of the community have expressed anxiety and concern with us. Well, is there something you don't know? Or could something happen? And we do understand that, and we honor and respect that anxiety and concern. We've made our best attempts to reassure that we just do not see that within the next calendar year, in advance of Plan Lee Highway wrapping up. But we do understand those needs and those concerns, and we'll be continuing to stay involved with Plan Lee Highway. And we do plan to reconcile and return to these provisions as part of the multifamily reinvestment study through the course of the next year, as well as the Plan Lee Highway process. You can see on the viewer here how these schedules are closely aligned. And it's important to understand the different scale and geographies that these major efforts encompass. Now, of course, the Plan Lee Highway study, as with the county's long history of sector planning areas, focused within a defined geography. That study area is on our map in attachment 2. Now, the multifamily reinvestment study, on the other hand, it does cover all of our multifamily areas outside of our areas subject to area and sector plans, the quote unquote unplanned areas. So wrapping up, we're here before you tonight. We will be in front of the Housing Commission later this week. And then we are on the agenda for the county board later this month. And so with that, Mr. Chair, I'll close with our recommendation that the Planning Commission recommend that the board approve the edits to the zoning ordinance as specified in attachment 1 of your staff report this evening on this affordable housing building height modification provision. Myself and Ms. Smith and Mr. Tucker would be happy to answer any questions.
Thank you, Mr. Rogers. First, we have a couple of other things to go through. Madam Clerk, do we have any public speakers for this?
Yes, we do. I'm pulling them up on our screen at this moment. We have 7 speakers this evening.
Okay. Our first speaker then is Mr. Byrne. Mr. Byrne, please go up mute and you can start your 3 minutes. Mr. Byrne, are you there? I don't see Dr. Byrne on the list of attendees.
Okay.
We'll move on to John Snyder. Mr. Snyder, you can go off mute and start your 3 minutes.
Okay, thank you. Can you hear me?
Yes, we can.
Great. Well, thank you for the opportunity to speak to you tonight. I am in support of this proposal, but I need to tell you that it was a very difficult process for me to come to support this because of the lack of process that I encountered here. I didn't find out about this proposal until it had already been voted on by the county board. And I'm in the Columbia Pike community, plugged in with a lot of different organizations there. And we received no communication at all about this proposal. And until Friday at noon, no indication at all that the Pike neighborhoods plans had been exempted from this, which really was building a great deal of opposition to it unnecessarily. The Pike form-based code has actually been very successful as it relates to affordable housing. Under the commercial form-based code, it's actually added 378 units of affordable housing with 0 displacement. That's 0 displacement of existing units because they're in commercial areas where there aren't any residential units. 100 units have been saved at the Grove project through the neighborhoods form-based code, and 229 other units have been added. So in going forward on this, the Pike should be an example of how to do this. And the way it's been successful is that there are specific rules. We already have rules for transitions. We already know what the density can be. We already know how many units are going to be preserved from it. So it's absolutely critical in dealing with the communities, particularly those that are welcoming affordable housing, as is the Columbia Pike community, or at least parts of the community, that we respect the plans that have been made and respect the people and the organizations that have made them. It's absolutely critical to keep the what we have, the consensus for affordable housing that has been built on the Pike over quite a few years. Other areas of the county, as you're planning this forward, should look to the Pike as an example of how to preserve affordable housing and actually to create affordable housing without causing serious concerns with the neighborhoods that can't be overcome. So those are the points that I wanted to make for this, but I do support the proposal as a temporary transition to more planning, and hopefully those plans will look more like the Columbia Pike form-based code. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Snyder. Our next speaker will be Stuart Stein. Mr. Stein, your go off mute and take your 3 minutes.
Can you hear me okay?
Yes, we can.
Okay. I have the same concerns about the intensity of development as I did in 2019 when the caps were removed for density bonuses. The staff wisely removed the height bonuses in light of unlimited density. The impact of height bonuses on communities is one of the reasons that it was rarely used. To reinstate that bonus with the lack of any cap on density almost guarantees tremendous pressure for redevelopment and a great increase in the intensity of that development, the scale of that development, and the impacts on the communities involved. I believe in the end, this further incentivizing of redevelopment will increase the loss of affordability, increase land values, and increase gentrification. I know many people consider marks and preservation to be a lost cause. But even if the increase in marks is a blip caused by the pandemic, I hope that there will be more efforts made to hold on to some of the gains while stemming the losses. Discussions around the master plan and other conversations included adding tools, and I believe this is still a possibility. The APA project is in my community, and my civic association has not yet heard a thing from them. Considering the impact that these projects will have on communities throughout much of the county, you would think that the level of engagement would be much higher, and the key stakeholders would include civic associations and communities where the zoning districts exist, along with the developers, businesses, and other organizations. No matter what happens, I want to stress that my greatest concern is for my neighbors that live in these buildings. I expect APA to try and make sure that no one will be permanently displaced by their project, and that arrangements will be made so that at least no one will have to leave their community and schools. They should guarantee a new unit for current residents at no greater cost than they are paying now. The county should put in specific requirements for these things for all projects receiving bonuses. There should be a goal of zero displacement of current residents by a policy designed to provide affordable housing. While the staff is hoping for a nuanced and incremental increase in heights, it is my experience that the maximum envelope is usually what's asked for. I am not convinced by the discussion about mitigation yet. If this is an interim policy, then I think density caps should be reinstated for the projects that select to use bonus height rather than the harm from such potential increases in the intensity of development. I greatly appreciate how quickly staff got back to me and answered my questions. I also appreciate their hard work at trying to come up with thoughtful solutions to a very complex problem and continuing to improve the proposal. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Stein. I see that Dr. Byrne has joined us. Dr. Byrne, you can go off mute and take your 3 minutes.
Okay. Yeah, I just wanted to say, I'm talking basically about the bonus density or the extra density of these particular zoning districts for the for affordable housing. I generally think that these things get overused. As the previous speaker said, they raise this. They already, before they even ask for anything, they go to the maximum. And they ask for this additional for affordable housing, and that exceeds even more. Now, when you increase density, you very often you see spread out. You take away the trees, and you take away the bushes and you're not getting anything back to this for the community. Certain selected people who are lucky enough to get into these buildings will get it. In some cases, these are actually luxury buildings, and they get swimming pools and concierges and things like this if they're new buildings. And we've seen this in Boston. So they can get really, really luxurious things, and this is based on affordable housing, increased density, which does use it, takes out trees. In the case of height, of course, it increases the urban heat effect, and it adds traffic and everything else to the infrastructure. The point is, this is overdone because, as I say, you can particularly see it with the people who are going to the new luxury housing. And they're getting these benefits that other people don't have, like a swimming pool on site and things like that. People come from all over the country. You can get on waiting lists, and you'll get on waiting lists, and you apply to a lot of places, a lot of different places, in a lot of different cities, and you'll eventually find a good one. This is the benefit. This is the outcome of what happens when you do this. But you don't give bonus density on top of all the other things for this. And it's just a bad idea. First, they pick it on one particular thing. They say, okay, on this zoning district, then they'll say, okay, this Columbia Pike. Then they'll say on this other zoning district. Well, you have to realize that this is really just attracting people from other areas to come here. They don't even have to work in Arlington. They can work in D.C. It's easy. A lot of these places are right near Metro. So just think about this. People don't address it. Just think of the loss of trees, if that bonus density means that, and the loss of biophilia when they build. You can't build meadows or anything else when they increase density. It's a trade-off. And people just assume, oh, we need affordable housing. Not that badly. There's plenty of people can commute. They do commute to places like Herndon, where it is affordable. They have buses and Metro. And the whole thing is just, it doesn't make sense when you really look at it, to lose what you've got and bring in people from other places that may not even work in Arlington. But this is the effect. And we could also get very good housing if you get one of these new ones. Okay, that's all.
Thank you, Dr. Byrne. Our next speaker is Susan Bell. Ms. Bell, let's timer resets to 0. Back to 3 minutes. Okay, you can go off mute and take your 3 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Good evening, members of the Commission. My name is Susan Bell, and I'm speaking as chair of the APA board in support of this amendment. I'm somewhat familiar with the provision that was formerly in the zoning ordinance. I spent a number of years enforcing the old ordinance as zoning administrator for the county. But I recognize that the proposal is first and foremost a restoration of an updated version of that provision that was in the ordinance starting in 1972. But there are important guardrails that the staff has added to this amendment to safeguard communities, and I think they're worth noting. First and foremost, this amendment pertains to 100% affordable projects. Arlington doesn't see many of those every year. Secondly, this amendment requires that these be approved through public hearings by the county board through the site plan process. So that means that any development will be reviewed by the community on multiple occasions through the site plan review committee, various commission hearings, civic association presentations, potentially at partnership meetings, the Planning Commission, the Housing Commission, Transportation Commission, and ultimately the county board. So there'll be many opportunities to provide feedback and to raise concerns about the design. Thirdly, this amendment has important guardrails around the context in which the project is being built. The prior amendment strictly spoke to affordability and percentages. This one includes the requirement that the context of the neighboring community be respected, and that it be looked at and that tapering be provided, so that the board has to make a specific finding that the proposed project is not harming that adjacent community. What it does add is an important flexibility for affordable housing projects frequently located on difficult to develop sites with topography where a flat building really will undermine the achievement of the affordable housing that it proposes. We all should not lose sight of the fact that this is a community that has lost affordable housing to redevelopment, to renovation, to rent increases, even during the pandemic. And this tool being restored to the ordinance puts another tool in the toolbox that will facilitate accomplishment of affordable housing for not only people that work here and live here, but people who should be here and can't be here right now. Thank you, and I'm happy to answer any questions.
Thank you, Ms. Bell. We'll now move on to our 5-minute speakers. First one is Ann Bodine. You can go off mute and take your time.
Yes, can you hear me?
Yes, I can.
Great. Mr. Chair, Commissioners, and staff, I'm Ann Bodine. I represent Arlingtonians for Our Sustainable Future. Let me begin by thanking the staff and the Commission for their public service and the extensive work that has gone into this effort. That said, ASF asked the Commission to reject the staff proposal to give the County Board wide discretion to add up to 60 additional feet in building height. ASF strongly favors affordable housing. We believe it can be achieved by other, more flexible means than rezoning, which can never be undone. We asked the Planning Commission to begin reviewing more flexible policy tools, insofar as the current approach to both growth and affordable housing are resulting in gentrification and an upward ratcheting of land and housing prices. The county needs to consider tools that take the exorbitant land price out of the equation, whether it be through a public housing authority, co-ops, community land trusts, or other initiatives. Before you consider any bonus density, ASF asked for a report on the costs and benefits derived from other bonus densities the board has passed in the past year, including density for senior housing, for green building initiatives, for affordable housing, and via site plan approval processes, to include the following impacts. Fiscal impacts. How will the county pay for and provide sites for schools, parks, roads, public safety, and health facilities for the many new residents it has approved and which it will be approving with this proposal? How can you even assess the impact of today's proposal when the board is given wide latitude to select formulas or outcomes that no one can predict in advance? In terms of environmental impacts, please assess and publish reports on the impacts of previously awarded bonus density as well as today's proposal in terms of additional teardowns, including existing market rate affordables. Please provide impacts from the assumed continued application of our current construction model to use concrete and steel for structures above 4 stories. Such methods are one of the main contributors to climate change. How will our tree canopy be impacted? How will our air quality be impacted with the expected influx of more cars and no corresponding investment in added mass transit? How many new parks are you asking the county to authorize with this new zoning? How many new schools? And where will you put them? Where is your long-term public facilities master plan? In terms of social impacts, ASF applauds the social benefit of 100% affordable units. However, we note there is some hypocrisy of zoning that will provide incentives for owners of older market rate buildings to raise them, which is the effect we foresee here. ASF also strongly objects to anything less than 100% affordable, as it provides non-transparent discretion to our elected officials who have shown they are more concerned about growth for growth's sake than for the sustainability of our community. Our zoning code is 400 pages. Why can't it bear up under the weight of the kind of specificity that bonus density should provide by strictly enumerating the terms of our affordable housing policy? We ask that staff and the Planning Commission clarify to what extent builders can provide moderate income units versus low or low moderate income, and to define how this policy will encourage deep affordability. If we are just masking subsidies for units for mostly 80% of AMI, then ASF opposes that game plan. We ask more study be given to the extent to which owners of naturally occurring affordable housing will be incentivized to remove those homes, possibly creating a net loss of affordables, as alluded to by another speaker. We understand some of the affected neighborhoods do not feel they were sufficiently involved in the process, which could bring new 12-story buildings, a jarring change for any community. Staff told the county board last month that the site plan review process would help guard against excesses and ensure proper transition to less dense neighborhoods. However, guidelines for transitions to neighboring areas are being ignored right now in projects between Clarendon and Ashton Heights, among others. Such assurances therefore fall flat and call for more specific guarantees. This is not a simple site plan approval. This level of density is significant. At a minimum, planners should provide an assessment before approving this recommendation of the 20-year impact on our skyline inside these multifamily zones. For all these reasons, we believe the current proposal is premature and should be shelved until the county can produce a great deal more information. Thank you so much for your attention.
Thank you, Ms. Bodine. Our next speaker is Carmen Romero. We're off mute and we're ready to hear from you.
Good evening, Mr. Chairman, members of the Planning Commission. I'm here to speak in support of this change to the zoning ordinance. This measure looks to restore bonus height flexibility to the county board that was eliminated in 2019. Any proposed project requesting this flexibility would undergo a robust site plan review process. The guidance in the zoning amendment requires that developers such as APA would need to propose developments that buffer to the neighborhoods when implemented. We also understand that additional flexibility invites more open space at the ground level, such as what we were able to do at Queens Court, where we are locating now with a public park. Further, the amendment that that staff has you had before you today calls for using this flexibility to advance the 100% affordable housing developments to help the county meet its growing need for affordable housing. Both the county's affordable housing master plan, as well as the more recently established Urban Institute estimates, Arlington will need 10,000 new low to middle income units between now and 2030. To make it happen, the county does need new flexibility and land use tools, such as the bonus density that was adopted in 2019 in conjunction with the bonus heights, so that we can actually achieve those policy goals, especially when there are sites near transit. Since COVID, and you heard staff talk about it earlier, Mr. Rogers talked about the need for Arlington County to not forego opportunities when presented. And I think that's true today. Last month in the 2021 Virginia State competition for affordable housing tax credits, the main equity tool for creating affordable housing, there was not a single Arlington County project before the state. Nor was there really much in Northern Virginia at all. And this is going to continue to happen if we can't work together to be creative to move projects forward. In the past, APA's had to undergo expensive multi-year changes to general land use plan studies in order to be able to advance affordable housing. And despite our best efforts, we haven't been able to meet the production goals as articulated in the Affordable Housing Master Plan. Specific to this proposal, APA has a 3.5 acre campus, the Marbella campus near Route 50. We do advocate for this. We advocated against the zoning change in 2019 because we wanted to begin planning that project. But we have decided that we wanted to wait to see how this process evolved and would welcome a conversation with the leadership of Ray Pham and Mr. Stein here today, because it would clearly be our intent to bring forward a project that the community could support, that would ensure that our residents were part of the relocation back into the new buildings. We're also planning on just rehabbing some of the existing garden apartments so that we really have, within any proposal we put forward, a mix of building typologies as well as community benefits. And we will be starting that outreach really now that this process, depending on how this process unfolds over the course of the next week with the county board. Lastly, we do applaud staff clarifying the language in their amendment based on feedback they received from people and groups throughout the county, most notably Mr. Snyder, who's here reflecting the Columbia Pike community. We do believe in honoring community plans, such as the form-based code, the neighborhood's form-based code, and the Lee Highway sector plan when that comes about in the near future, and look forward to having projects and being part of those dialogues so that our future developments along Lee Highway benefit from feedback from that community as well. In short, thank you to the county manager and the planning staff for trying to help advance tools that will create affordable policy objectives of the county.
Thank you, Ms. Romero. Our next and final speaker is Pam Gillen. You're go off mute, and it's up to you, Ms. Gillen.
Thank you. Hello, everyone. My name is Pamela Gillen. I'm a former Planning and Economic Development Commissioner, currently president of Lee Highway Alliance. And thank you, Nick, for highlighting some of our conversation last week. You took some of the wind out of my talking points. Prior to the county's current planning of the Lee Highway corridor, the community led by Sandy Chesherone and Ginger Brown spent years of community engagement, resulting in the community endorsement of 9 guiding principles for a master plan. Affordable housing is one of those key guiding principles. Lee Highway's corridor has numerous RA zoned sites, as well as quite a few multifamily reinvestment districts. There are over 4,400 multifamily units, and a good number of them are affordable housing. We do support affordable housing and the intent of this amendment as well. We hope that our final plan will add a considerable number of affordable housing units to our community. 8 years ago, Sandy and Ginger led the initial Civic Association president meetings that started the community engagement for creating a plan. Now, after several years of delays in the Plan Lee Highway effort that started in 2018, we are excited to be on the very cusp of seeing the county's concept plans for land use and height. The community meeting schedule will be released shortly. We hope to all see you there, with the first community meeting happening in just 3 or so weeks. After all the years of waiting, the community is having heartburn and anxiety, as Nick mentioned, over the county board adopting this amendment just a week before we finally see the land use and heights plan. Adopting this proposal as currently presented will create community consternation right before the key crucial planning stage. We want the focus of the community energetic discussion to be on the planning effort and not the possible impact of this ordinance on our community that has no plan. While staff is assuring us that the plan will be completed in 2022, the track record from the past tells the community that this is no guarantee that that will happen. Lee Highway Alliance wants to mitigate the community anxiety over the possibility that any one of our numerous RA properties will not be going from a 4-story building up to 10 stories while we wait for this final plan. We request the Planning Commission and staff to consider 3 recommendations. The first recommendation is we request that additional language be added in the staff report, pages 14 through 15. After the statement, the proposed increased height provisions would not be eligible within areas subject to an area sector plan, area plan, sector plan, PDSP, or other county board approved planning policies. We like the additional language stating that the Plan Lee Highway plan was in its final planning stages when the amendment was proposed, and that once the plan is finalized, it too shall be part of the many planning documents that are the guiding documents. Second request is we request that the zoning category RA 818 be removed from the amendment until the completion of the final land use scenarios, at which point it could be added to the ordinance. This will mitigate the risk that if the plan is delayed again, properties will not be developed with bonus height that doesn't fit the final Lee Highway plan. And finally, as supporters of affordable housing, we want to be sure that this ordinance provides the most affordable housing possible. We suggest the final language in the ordinance, which reads, in instances where less than 100% of the dwelling units would be considered low or moderate income housing, and the development project is overall consistent with the Affordable Housing Master Plan, the county may modify the maximum building height regulations as specified in 15.5.9.A.3.B. We like that to be amended. A significant amount of affordable housing should be clearly defined. We suggest a minimum percentage of affordable housing units be met before any developer county negotiations occur. So thank you, staff and planning commissioners, for your time and dedication to making the county a better place. That's all.
Thank you, Ms. Gillen. Our speakers are now over. Do we have any commissions that would like to speak? Not hearing any. We can now move to, it is now with the Planning Commission. Commissioner Patel, do you have a report for us from ZOCO?
Thank you, Chairperson Lantelmi. We, as Mr. Rogers noted, we heard this matter in January, and then thereafter there was a, I apologize. No, it's my husband's phone. And then thereafter there was an amendment, as Mr. Rogers reported. We did not subsequently hear this matter. Mr. Rogers sent an email directly to planning commissioners regarding the limitations regarding scope of the amendment to the ordinance as we heard it in January. So that's essentially an update up until this point. And then
thank you, Commissioner.
I don't know if you want me to go ahead and move into kind of areas of discussion for us today.
Yes, please do. Yes,
Okay.
absolutely, please do.
Thank you very much. So we thank you, Mr. Rogers, for that really wonderful presentation, kind of bringing us back up to speed and reminding us, refreshing our recollections on where we were previously and where we are now. In pre-meeting discussions and subsequent discussions with co-chair we did identify specific areas that we thought would be beneficial for planning commissioners to consider, though some of these may be moot now given the presentation and some of the comments from the speakers. One specific area that we wanted to think about is the impact of the amendment on equity, and equity being defined as people in communities who have been historically disadvantaged or negatively impacted by planning decisions generally, and in particular Arlington. So that is a bucket of that we want to make sure that we're specifically addressing. The other issue is the impact of this amendment on the SPRC and special gov processes. That being part and parcel of the bigger issue, which I think Mr. Rogers did a good job addressing, is the geographic application or implication of the proposed amendment. And then the other major area, I think, is addressing the discretion given to the county board to modify the affordability or income requirements related to this amendment.
Thank you, Commissioner Patel. So those are the three areas of discussion. Do any commissioners have any other areas of discussion that they would like to put into the mix? Yes, Commissioner Steinberger.
So I think the answer is that this would fall under the third item that Commissioner Patel just addressed in terms of discretion given to the county board. But I wanted to confirm that if we wanted to look at sort of narrowing the language or defining what the significant percent or significant impact language was, that would also fall under that criteria in terms of a conversation.
Okay. Narrowing the language of the, what was that?
Of the discretion, kind of, if we wanted to look at that secondary language about narrowing what would be a significant contribution to affordable housing, if we're looking at specific narrowing language to that effect, that would also fall under the discretion conversation that Commissioner Patel already had raised.
Okay, I got that. Thank you.
Thank you.
Commissioner Siegel.
Right. Thank you, Commissioner Lantelmi. Could we talk a little bit about the concerns raised by the Lee Highway Alliance representative, Pam Gillen?
Sure. Okay. First, so there are any other, Commissioner Morton, I see your hand is up.
Thank you very much, Chair Lantelmi. I believe this was covered or potentially covered in Commissioner Patel's discussion of the SPRC process, but I wanted to make sure the issue of the effective transition was discussed.
Transition from the site to the surrounding neighborhood transitions?
Correct.
Yes. Okay, thank you. Okay. Any other commissioners want to add to the discussion? Seeing no hands, it is now with the commission. So our first discussion item is impact on equity. Does anybody have any comments on that? Have any questions for Mr. Rogers or observations?
Chairman Lantel, oops, I'm sorry, I'll let Ms. Guerin go.
Yes, Commissioner Guerin and then Commissioner Patel.
Thank you, Chair Lantelmi, and I'd be interested in hearing Commissioner Patel's thoughts as well. With regard to equity, I wonder if staff looked into whether other jurisdictions have done something similar and they were able to see if there was a greater dispersal of the affordable units with an effort like this or an increased concentration. Thanks.
Commissioner Guerin, I think how I'd like to respond to your question is in twofold. The first, and is something that has been alluded to in some of the discussion and hopefully in our staff report, how on average, we as a community, and sometimes as all of Northern Virginia, we see maybe 1 to 2 projects of this nature where 100% or near 100% of the units are affordable to residents earning either 60% of the AMI for rental or 80% of the AMI for home ownership occupation. So as far as dispersal goes and geographic distribution, we did not do the type of indexing that you described because of the small sample size, I would say, number one. But number two, with these projects, and this may be something that Mr. Tucker, if he sees fit, could elaborate on a bit further for the commission, as a goal and objective of the Affordable Housing Master Plan, and as part of our AHIF process where we're reviewing potential applicants through our NOFA, we do score and weight projects which are effectively distributing and creating new opportunities outside of neighborhoods where such opportunities have not been typically frequent in their establishment. So just a long-winded way of saying we're not seeking to, with our plans and policies and the implementation of them, we have some guideposts in place to avoid concentrations of affordable housing.
Thank you. I appreciate that. I guess what I was wondering was if essentially creating this greater value for the land, if one provides affordable housing versus market rate housing, if anyone else has done this, and if it resulted in the ability to provide affordable housing in a location that previously would not have worked because the land values were prohibitively high. I'm really trying to wrap my head around what we're doing here. And I know that our community is very supportive of dispersing this housing, at the same time making sure that they're in locations that can provide the services that might be needed, including transportation. So I just wondered if there was a sense of that. And in a quick look online, I did not find anything like that, but I didn't know if you or Mr. Tucker had done that research. And again, thank you for a good presentation, Mr. Rogers.
I think I'll jump in and say that I think as we explore new tools under Housing Arlington and in Arlington, I think we're broaching new ground every day. I think this is another example where we're contemplating doing something that has not been done in other places. So I don't think there's a track record in other locations, other jurisdictions that we can look to see how this has impacted land value or given an advantage to nonprofit or affordable housing developers over other types of developers. So I think, though, when we look at the specifics of what we're talking about, I'm not sure that it creates an advantage for the affordable developer. I just think that it increases opportunities for housing development or the development of affordable housing on a case-by-case basis where that exists. And doesn't necessarily have an overall impact on the real estate market per se.
Thank you, Mr. Tucker.
Thank you, Commissioner Gillen. Commissioner Patel, you were next.
Thank you. I also wanted to add to Commissioner Gillen's comment around dispersing affordable housing throughout the county. I think that that's an important goal. I think we all believe that that's an important goal for us to achieve. I want to address the issue around equity and making sure that we are looking at ways that our decisions, specifically these amendments to the zoning ordinance, are addressing issues that we need to be addressing on a historical perspective. So while we're talking about affordability, I don't want us to lose, and I don't want to conflate issues around affordability and diversity because that's very important for me. But I want to be cognizant that in each one of these amendments and whatever planning decisions that we're making, that we're taking a big picture look at what the impacts are on racial justice and addressing prior wrongs specifically within this community. So Mr. Rogers, I know we had a conversation around what we can do what planning can do in terms of looking at big picture, and not necessarily because we haven't created a tool thus far to have like an equity impact statement on these planning decisions that we're making. And until we're there, how can we get to a place where the Planning Commission and other commissions, including Housing Commission and Transportation, how can we get ourselves to a place where we understand what the impacts are by addressing the historic inequities and structural factors that have disproportionately affected minority communities around these planning decisions. And I don't know if you're prepared today to be able to center it within this particular amendment to this ordinance, but how do we get to that place where we're able to contextualize this within the big picture of what we're trying to do to really live up to that ideal of being an inclusive and diverse community? Thank you.
Commissioner Patel, I think how I'd like to respond would be particularly for our longer term studies, particularly where we have the room and the space within our scoping to truly be asking those questions. And there is a sentiment there that, there's a real challenge there that I appreciate to be asking those questions in all of our studies, whether it's a very condensed process, just implementing something that the Code of Virginia has changed in recent years, or something, these sort of 5 to 6 month short-term processes, or the longer period studies. There is a real need to us to continue to be challenging ourselves with those equity questions, and I think my best response is an affirmation and a commitment that we hear you, and that we hear the Commission is really eager and looking for us to be thinking in this way. I do think we are thinking with this way front and center on the missing middle housing study. We've done extensive analysis of these issues, and we'd like to have the opportunity to continue to be bringing that lens through future work as well.
Yeah, I'd like to jump in a little bit to follow up to Commissioner Patel's comments. I have noticed, for example, with the missing middle, a lot of history has been done about where the zoning ordinance originated and how it's been done. A couple of the other zoning ordinance modifications we've had over the past few years has specifically raised that they were done to disadvantage our minority communities. Have we started a project to start mapping land parcels in the county that have been burdened by restrictive covenants, or looked into history of bank lending where it might have, because before the Community Reinvestment Act, there were banks that were denying loans to minorities and only giving loans to white people. Have we started any of that sort of research yet to find out what the patterns of land use, how that correlates with the patterns of land use here in the county? Because that would be useful for us in determining equity issues, in determining equity burdens.
Mm-hmm. Mr. Chair, I believe some of my, I'm not sure off the top of my head. I will ask some of my other colleagues to chime in on that. I will say that to your benefit and to the other commissioners, as we've taken a look back at some of those historical zoning ordinance amendments that I mentioned, of course, we highlighted 5 of them in the staff report, but there are dozens of others throughout the decades, often back in the 1950s, 60s, and 70s, where an individual development applicant would approach county staff or an individual county board member with a development project and a vision on a specific site. And oftentimes sweeping zoning changes were made in order to increase height or eliminate minimum lot area requirements or other very substantial changes to the districts en masse in order to benefit individual projects. And many of those had built up over the years. I hope you can see with some of our more recent work, and even with the work in this study, how these studies we're certainly moving away from that and not attempting to serve the needs of an individual developer or development applicant or constituency, but trying to think broader about the existing land use patterns, the existing zoning map, and those broader implications.
I would just want to just point out very quickly that as part of the research compendium, there was a companion document that was completed by Virginia Tech students that looked into some of the history of residential development in Arlington. And although they didn't map where redlining occurred or where these restrictive covenants may have been, there's some history there. I know that some outside groups like Challenging Racism have looked at that as well. And there is a redlining map that shows, I think, a portion of Arlington. It's more of a DC regional map, which shows some detail related to redlining. But there's not an effort by the county to develop that information at this point.
Okay, thank you. I do think that would be useful information for us, and it probably is something that should be added to the list of projects the county should be, planning division should be pursuing. Thank you. Are there any other questions, comments on the impact on equity? We'll move on to impact on the, I'm sorry. Okay, nope.
I'm sorry, Commissioner Chair Lentemi, I would just agree with your last comment about the fact that I would support that same comment. That's the place where the county needs to be moving.
Okay, thank you, Commissioner Patel. Let's move on then to impact on the SBRC and the special growth study process, and also talk about transitions and what sort of guidance those processes can have in order to decide or to make recommendations to whether transitions are appropriate. Commissioner Hughes.
Thanks, Commissioner Lentemi. Oh, sorry, I got to adjust tonight. I'll sort of use this as an opportunity. I think, if memory serves me right, about 3 of the 4 last SPRCs for affordable housing projects I think I've chaired. And most notably, I would remind my fellow commissioners, the last one in which we were directly adjacent to single-family residential development. I think the public testimony this evening should enlighten my fellow commissioners on how close this evening came to being a very different conversation. And I'm not so sure that's not something we should still be having. We heard this evening a little consternation from Lee Highway Alliance. We heard the Arlington Sustainable folks very adamantly asking us not to do it. We heard Mr. Snyder from the Columbia Pike area mentioning that the form-based code and its successes. And I think in all of those things, what I think we're hearing from our community is that the amorphous blob that is our site plan is something that's tolerable within our defined metro zones. But as we move out from there, our commitment to the single family home, which is currently enshrined in the GLUP, I'd remind my fellow commissioners who believe it shouldn't be, need to be cognizant of the encroachment onto a different style of development and a different Arlington. As one of the former board members used to said, there were 3 Arlingtons and none of the 3 really speak to each other. What's so important for us to think about, though, as we go forward in this conversation and with site plans, Commissioner Lentemi, and for my fellow commissioners, is that amorphous blob is something that is not consistent with how you as a neighbor in one of these single family homes or townhomes know your neighbors. And what I mean by that is we all know that the setback for the giant McMansions is 8 feet on one side and 12 feet on the other. It's 25 feet from the street, and the box is very defined. And when many of my commissioners miss, and I've told you before, the wonderful thing about the form-based code is that same level of specificity is also applied at the form-based code when it abuts neighbors. And one of the things that does for us is you'll note that when we have form-based code projects, we rarely hear a bunch of angry neighbors. And I'm not out there chairing a 70-person angry neighbor meeting. about trying to build a phone. So I'm comfortable with the changes to the zoning ordinance this evening, but I will, for the public record, say to our affordable housing developers, this is with you to break, and it's important for them to hear that, because if they bring forward good projects in the right spots, then this is something good. But they could equally bring forward the wrong project that asks for too much in the wrong spot and break a whole system. And so that's what I'll leave with for as my fellow commissioners think about it. I think that hoping for the amorphous blob in some of these transitional communities is something we cannot do, and we're going to have to need to move to a level of specificity that's much more akin to our by right development. Thank you, Commissioner Lantomi.
Thank you, Commissioner Hughes. On to Commissioner Morton, then Commissioner Weir, and then Commissioner Geer.
Thank you. I'd also like to thank Mr. Rogers for, as usual, a thorough and clear report and presentation. I think I'm aligning myself with Commissioner Hughes, and I really want to support wholeheartedly these efforts to try to increase additional density into single-family neighborhoods where appropriate. I think it's interesting that we did hear today, as Mr. Hughes said, testimony from the form-based codes people about the lack of disagreement and discord when something predictable is put forward that at least establishes a common vocabulary and a common set of principles. I see, with some satisfaction that these projects will go to the SPRC process. I think I can charitably say the luck has been mixed in discussing architecture in a productive way, or even agreeing what to talk about. So I did see you had a slide number 10 that suggested some principles you'd use when talking about effective or sensitive transitions, but I wonder if you could elaborate a little bit on how would staff come to an SPRC meeting and how would they talk about the analysis that they did in order to decide that this was an effective transition, or how would you open up the conversation? So thank you very much.
No, you're welcome, and that's a big question. And so what I think the best way for us to approach that is what is multifamily development in the Arlington of today and the Arlington for the 21st century, and what does that look like, and how does that best match up with the neighborhoods that are in and around it. And so using prevailing development trends that we know about through development that's occurring now, that development is being contemplated, understanding the needs of our very unique market. There's that piece as well. But what we'd like to do, Commissioner Morton, as part of the multifamily reinvestment study, and I realize I'm tipping my hand a little bit and making a promise as opposed to the comprehensive response that I would prefer, but as part of the multifamily reinvestment study, what we're intending to bring to you and your colleagues is a policy guide that is not quite an urban design guideline document, but more a statement of principles and policies and expectations for multifamily development to weave into the community, to be seamless, to be a good neighbor to its surroundings, and to essentially put at the foot of members of the community as well as developers a set of a buffet of tools to be used, whether it's, and I forgive me for repeating myself, but the types of architectural facade treatments, the types of landscaping, or at least the form and character of it, the types of building placement and entrance placement in things that we adopt and we see as a community as something very Arlingtonian. And so again, going back to the short-term review process that we have before you tonight, the direction of the county manager, really looking at staff to develop a near-term tool so that the community can take advantage of opportunities in the near term. We are bringing this work before you tonight with understandably less specific language to provide maximum flexibility, but your comment is appropriate and one that we intend to address and more in full force with the broader multifamily reinvestment study.
And would you mind repeating when you think that study would be finished and ready to enter into the discussion? And are there any concepts that you've already developed that could be useful? My concern is that people, my experience is an applicant will say it fits, the community says it doesn't fit. And then the Planning Commission is trying to talk about, what vocabulary and what principles do we use to have that discussion, as opposed to getting hung up on things like color. You mentioned things like building orientation and the fenestration, the relationship with the street wall. I mean, does staff now have a set before the whole process is completed with this guide that you're talking about that we could use during SPRC? I think that would be really useful.
I agree, and I must admit I do not envy you and your colleagues' position in the middle of those tense discussions. You guys have a really tough job. We have some exploratory thinking that we've put together. I don't have something that's really ready for use in the coming weeks. But once we can finish up with this near-term work, we do want to return to that multifamily reinvestment study in earnest, keep that on schedule so that it's wrapping up with the schedule that I identified in the presentation earlier. We're anticipating that we'll be wrapping up and bringing something for adoption after the first of the year in 2022, and we hope to be back before you and your colleagues. That we haven't decided what the best format is. An LRPC briefing is one of the better ones that we've discussed, but we still have some staff work ahead of us over the course of the spring and summer, so that we can have that initial conversation with you and your colleagues and really begin earnest community engagement that we're anticipating to really kick off with great passion and intensity this fall.
Okay, thank you very much for the thoughtful response.
You're welcome.
Commissioner Weir.
Thank you, everyone. So, there's been a lot of emphasis tonight put on the idea that projects in multifamily districts need to conform to adjacent single-family neighborhoods. And I think that if we give much thought to things like the climate crisis or the costs, the climate crisis related costs of suburban development patterns, or of how much wealth we transfer from people living in apartments to pay for the streets and the sewers of people who live in urban single-family neighborhoods like the ones in Arlington, or of our goals to do things like pedestrian or transit-oriented development, or just the near-term and mid-term crisis level undersupply of housing. We need to acknowledge that we are approaching this bass-ackwards, that the moral approach is to ask, how can we make multifamily housing the new normal? How can we build housing in a way that allows and encourages and helps single-family neighborhoods to better transition to multifamily construction? If we want to avoid boiling the oceans, if we want a sustainable future, if we want to keep housing from simply becoming unaffordable to anyone who isn't a medieval level landed gentry, ultra rich, if we want to be the kind of community that doesn't just continue to transfer wealth from anyone who isn't wealthy to people who are extremely wealthy by subsidizing the infrastructure of low density neighborhoods, then we need to make the switch. We need to say that there comes a time where we prioritize multifamily buildings, and if the single family neighborhood needs to transition to the multifamily neighborhood, then that's the way that we're going to structure this, and that's the more moral way to structure this. My colleagues are absolutely correct that we need to take into account the implications for communities that have historically been kept from being able to benefit from changes. But when we look at the map of where this kind of a project, where this amendment is looking at, the zones tend to be along. There's a lot more on the map than just some of the neighborhoods that I think are going to be directly implicated here. But more to the point, we have to find a way to act as if perpetuating the single family development agenda is no longer the acceptable default assumption, because treating it as the default assumption is how we got to the climate crisis and the housing crisis that we are in right now. So just some general thoughts on some of the conversation that I've heard this evening. Thank you.
Thank you, Commissioner Ware. Commissioner Gillen, you are next.
Thank you, Commissioner Lantelmi, Chair Lantelmi. So I appreciate the conversation, and I can see why we're interested in a concept like this proposal. Admittedly, the housing costs are very high in our area, and we do need to find ways to make the provision and preservation of subsidized, committed, affordable units more affordable. How can we provide this? So I want to acknowledge the broad support. I don't think there's anyone here who is against providing more affordable housing, but we still have an obligation to consider our multiple policies and the concerns of the neighborhoods in which we're proposing to put this. So in addition to those raised, I have some concerns about tying height to the property, because height will last. And what happens if ownership changes and affordability changes? The reality is some of our best plans have changed just in the last few years. Amenities that we thought we would have, we no longer have access to, and we make plans and policies around those. And so given that concern, I support the concerns of my colleagues, Commissioner Morton and others who have raised this tonight and at other times about making sure that the proposed designs do fit. Does this fit, and how do we know? I think this is a really good question. So I find this proposal and these sort of uncertainties, this is going to be most palatable with that sort of additional guidance with regard to how the additional height and the additional density are going to be accommodated within each individual proposal for each site, ensuring that we're not just supporting the affordable housing, which is a laudable goal, but ensuring the fit within each neighborhood. Thank you.
Thank you, Commissioner Gillen, Commissioner Sarli, and then Commissioner Siegel.
Thank you, Commissioner Lantelmi. I'll begin by saying that I want to align myself with Commissioner Weir's comments. I think the sentiments are definitely should be part of a conversation. Perhaps we're not giving it its due. But having said that, I'm going to transition over to the more sort of applicable aspect of the conversation, and I will align myself now with Mr. Hughes' comments. And I was intrigued by his idea of bringing the form-based code and how that has been a successful process. I think instead of going for maximum flexibility, we should go for maximum specificity. I think the more you put on the table, the more the onerous of changing and asking for a different situation is no longer on us or on staff, but now it's on the developer. Same thing happened with Crystal City when we're having this conversation, this notion that creativity suffers when there's restrictions on it. Au contraire, creativity is triggered by these sort of very prescriptive and defined parameters in which then you try to create something beautiful and effective and or inexpensive and or affordable. So I would encourage staff, and I think Commissioner Morton was mentioning this, that this would be very helpful to us to have a very specific set of guidelines that are very prescriptive, particularly relating to transitions. I wrote down typologies. We could almost set up a list of typologies of transitions. But again, the more information, the more specificity. Forget this idea of flexibility. That's a very bad. What's the word I'm thinking of? We don't need flexibility. We need to know exactly what to expect. We need to know exactly how that's going to be implemented. And if there is a problem or if there is an alternative, then the developer or the applicant has to bring that to us and justify why we need to get away from what we as a community have decided is the good solution that we're looking for. I think this idea that the onerous is on us it really needs to move away. I strongly urge staff to bring it almost to a form-based code level. Specify this really clearly. Thank you. And again, great presentation, Mr. Roger. I really appreciate it. And Mr. Tucker, I think we worked together on the form-based code, so he knows exactly what the process is and how there are some problems with that. But I know that your experience will come in handy as we go forward. So thank you.
Thank you, Commissioner Sarli, Commissioner Siegel, then Commissioner Steinberger.
I just want to say, I think this is a very meaningful discussion, a very important discussion, not only because of the larger issues of climate going into the future and how we can plan the built environment to be consistent with or to work with the anticipated changes. That those issues are issues of principle that I do think I have some optimism that I think maybe more than Commissioner Weir that we are grappling with that maybe more slowly than some would like, but we are. So the conversation is very important for that reason. The other reason the conversation is very important is that I think Commissioner Morton has framed an issue for this particular exercise, these three zoning districts and what kind of built environment housing stock is currently contained therein, and their lack of redevelopment and their that's extremely important. And I do, with respect to that, have one question for Nick. But before I go to that question, I think the issue of what is the common framework that we use when we do an SPRC? We kind of don't have one, or if we do, it's quite buried, and we don't have really commissioners come from all walks of expertise, maybe don't have a common language because we have different training to deal with that. So I think this is important. Maybe there are other frameworks we'd use for other types of development, but right now we're talking about transitions that we'd have to rethink if building heights are allowed to go up with these three districts. I think Commissioner Sarli was very persuasive in the way he discussed possibly form-based code, more specificity, less flexibility. That I think is very helpful to start this conversation. This is really right in the lap of staff, and I'm seeing that staff is open to more Commissioner, yes, Rogers, Mr. Rogers, sorry, I forgot your last name. Staff is quite open to collaboration, particularly since SPRC is the Planning Commission's baby, and we are struggling. We do struggle with what are the criteria we're using if we don't have a form-based code, something really strict and structured. So I just want to say I'm very grateful to commissioners for this very robust and difficult conversation, but it gets at a long-term problem. So my question for you, Mr. Rogers, is when you say we might we envision coming up with something that's not quite design guidelines, what did you mean by that?
So there are some other examples that we can cite once we, and I dislike having to speak in the theoretical, Commissioner Siegel, and I hope that you and I can both sort of remember this moment once we're back before you and your other fellow colleagues later this year, and saying, okay, here's what I said. How did we do? But we'd be happy to cite some of the good examples for again, not design guidelines, but more. I don't have a better way to say them, but just sort of principles and ideals and goals and objectives for particularly multifamily development that we've seen in other different communities, you know, a couple of them in California, believe it or not, that sort of lay out principles and expectations for you know, perhaps not the specificity of a number of inches of you know, circumference of you know, tree trunks at diameter at breast height necessarily, but really using visuals to give the look and the feel of, hey, these are the types of tools that you need to show in your development proposal, in your renderings, in your official projects. This is what we want to be seeing. And so quite frankly, I'm pleased that the commission has utilized their discussion tonight for this. There's a lot of what myself and my colleagues are hearing that aligns very closely with the exploratory thinking that we've done with the multifamily reinvestment study, and I'm looking forward to it advancing some of these conversations. To bluntly answer your question, though, we're envisioning a policy document that's rich in photos and design language, not necessarily to the specificity of a form-based code, which is ultimately a regulatory document, very, very technical. We're not envisioning something that's very, very technical that can be used, but more of a how-to guide of this is what we want in our multifamily zoning outside of our area in sector plans.
Just one follow-up, Commissioner Len, tell me really quickly, given the obvious interest on part of the commission for this particular issue, and thank you for welcoming the conversation, would the commission perhaps be able to take a crack or help you review what you come up with prior to action at a PC meeting, an LRPC or however that might fit? Because I think we do have an architect, we have an urban planner on the commission, and I think they could be very helpful in giving some feedback. And now, because there's a lot of experience with participating in SPRC and seeing where we feel uncomfortable with it, that just might be very helpful. So I'm just requesting a shot at this before it comes back to us in full Planning Commission session.
Yeah, request granted. We intend to use some combination of LRPC and ZOCO to have that fulsome conversation you're describing.
Wonderful, thank you.
Before I move on to Commissioner Steinberger and Commissioner Patel, I'll remind people that please be, if you can just associate yourself with earlier comments or be brief. We are really running tight on time. We theoretically have another another agenda item. I will be putting off the administrative items until Wednesday, meaning our minutes and our reports. But we are still running tight on time, and we still have motions, and I expect they're going to have some discussion over our motions for this item. Commissioner Steinberger.
Thank you. So by way of associating myself with comments, I do want to associate myself with Commissioner Hughes' comments and Commissioner Guerin's comments. Sort of come to mind most quickly. I guess what I'm still confused on is sort of the timing of having this vote now and making the decision that we're going to, move forward with this flexibility and again, in these certain specific zones, but with the idea that there's more guidance coming. And I'm confused as to sort of what the timing of when the guidance would sort of be available and why we're sort of having the vote now when we don't really know when we'd be using the guidance. And I'm just struggling with that because I think the balance here is between specificity and flexibility. And I think that's a fine line we need to walk. I certainly think that there could be scenarios in which this sort of development is desirable and giving that additional height in certain circumstances makes a lot of sense. But I'm struggling with sort of how this seems to have been split from the guidance that I view as necessary to moving forward. And I'm just not understanding that. Thank you.
Commissioner Steinberger, Commissioner Lantilme, I think I can address a little bit of that, and even back even back in January at your ZOCO meeting, we were talking about this in a bit more generalized terms, in communicating to the commission how in our normal conversations and in the frequent conversations, whether it's we on staff, just like yourselves, are involved with frequent conversations with members of the development community, both on the market rate side and the for-profit side, and particularly, or the nonprofit side, and particularly those nonprofit affordable housing developers, the ones that are seeking those low-income housing tax credits that Ms. Romero spoke about in her public comment. There's a very predictable cycle on those. Where it's in and around this time every year that those are being reviewed and awarded for the individualized projects. And so backing out of that, it's usually the balance of the previous year that the individual applicants are working on their development proposals. And there's a real sense of urgency to have the approvals and entitlement in place at the end of the year in advance of the next cycle. And so in discussing the 2021 calendar with the manager's office, informing them of how we had the need to expand the scope of HCD, but to tackle that work in sort of the comprehensive way that you heard me speak about with Commissioner Siegel, the direction we were provided was to not only continue with this effort, but to be thinking about the near term as well, and to give the board in the near term immediate flexibility, so that on a case by case basis for these near term projects, the board could be in a position to provide some height flexibility if needed. The board at their RTA session and earlier tonight, you heard from Ms. Romero and APA how they're pursuing a project at the Marbella Apartments. That is one of the potential developments that we back in January were thinking as potential, and now as we get more into the year, APA is pursuing that in earnest now. So with the multifamily reinvestment study not scheduled to wrap up until March of 2021. Anyone, sort of APA with this project in particular, but those projects would need to be delayed another 12 months and put off yet another year in order to take advantage of the multifamily reinvestment studies, the new tools, the optional zoning standards that would come with that. And so that's really the timing. We were tasked with providing a near-term solution, with the understanding that near-term solution would be reevaluated and reconciled and perhaps even replaced with the ultimate multifamily reinvestment study recommendations.
Question on that, if I may follow up. But I'm correct, there's no sunset on this change. There's not a formal sunset proposed.
There's no formal sunset proposed.
Can we tie the sunset to the issuing of the multifamily zoning study?
You could, but that's not our recommendation.
Okay, I think that's my recommendation.
Okay.
I'm struggling a little bit. This just feels like on the line between specificity and flexibility, we've gone too far to flexibility in my mind. And I'm struggling with finding that walkability. And I appreciate the explanation you just gave for why we're doing this now and the timing of it. That was spot on. That I really appreciate that. That was a very clear answer, and it really helped me. And I want to be a good partner to our affordable housing developers and be able to not push them to delay a whole year. Understanding the funding cycle, like that was very clear. But I'm still struggling with how far to the quadrant of extreme flexibility we are when I think we don't need to be there. There's other opportunities here. I'll leave it at that for now. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Commissioner Steinberger. Commissioner Patel and then Commissioner Hughes, and I'd like to wrap up this portion of the conversation.
Thank you.
Mr.
Rogers, you may recall that during our conversations, I had this question around the flexibility of I called it the discretion kind of component for the county board. I agree with the comments of my fellow commissioners with regard to creating more guidelines or principles, kind of big picture items when we are looking at these specific sites. But I also want to make sure that we are also creating guidelines and principles for our discussions with regard to equity. And specifically, I think that this is a great place for us to start having statements in our reports, in staff reports, around the racial and social implications of projects that may be using some of these new opportunities that we are looking to build upon, especially because they come in the name of equity and affordability. So I again just raise this as another place where we can look at creating guiding principles that the community can stand behind and then be able to test those principles in each specific project that comes up. Thank you.
Thank you. Commissioner Hughes.
Thanks, Commissioner Lantemi. I'll be real brief because I just wanted to respond to Commissioner Steinberger's comment or statements before we get to motions. Just a reminder to my fellow commissioners, this is a zoning text amendment. So generally speaking, we don't tie zoning text amendments, which stand, as Commissioner Steinberger properly stated, forever until changed, to amorphous studies that we have planned dates for completing. So just wanted to make sure that that was set out there. And Commissioner Steinberger, one of the reasons that I had initially considered limiting or suggesting the limitation of the amendment to the RA 615 zone is the particular zone of zoning overlaying the project that Mr. Rogers has put forward this evening as being the most urgent amongst many. With that, Commissioner Lantemi, I yield time. Thank you.
Thank you. Our next topic is the county board's discretion in narrowing the language, though I think that to a large extent, the discussion we've just had really touched on that or covered that. Does anybody have something different to add on that? But otherwise, I'd like to move on to the Plan-Lee Highway Alliance, Plan-Lee Highway effort concerns. Commissioner Patel, your hand is still up, or is that just a remnant from before? Okay, hearing nothing. Why don't we move then on to the concerns about the Plan-Lee Highway effort? Before we start that, I just do want to note that I am on the board of the Lee Highway Alliance. And I'm vice president of the Lee Highway Alliance as of about a month ago. I have checked with the county attorney, and that does not constitute a conflict of interest. But in the just for appearances, I wanted to make sure that you're aware of that. Anyway, the discussion is now open for those concerns. Commissioner Schroll.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Rogers wanted to, thank you again for your presentation this evening, as others have. Question that was raised by Ms. Gillen this evening was the option of, or I guess the request to define that kind of substantial investment in affordable housing. So I would like kind of staff's reaction to that, and then also the reaction to why staff has not set a floor, kind of a minimum threshold below 100% committed affordable. So if you could respond to both of those issues.
So I'll thanks for the question, Commissioner Schroll. And again, this may sound like some of my presentation and some similar answers that I gave, but this is an issue where, given the small sample size, number one, but given the unique and complex funding sources that could come into an affordable housing project, particularly when they're serving an even more needy community, let's say, for lack of a better word, unfortunately, we felt a need to to be flexible. I think our preference would be to be a bit more specific, but there is the scenario where some very unique projects serving, like some of the examples that I highlighted in the staff report, a number of residents with deeper affordability needs than that typical 60% AMI. How many residents, or how much, for example, how much, if it was a mixed use project to help fund some of that, how many market rate units would need to be included to balance that? And ultimately, does the board think that 50% split is appropriate, 60, 70, 80, depends on the scale, depends on the site. And so with so much variability, we felt the need, and again, given the short-term review process that we've been working in, to be as responsive in the near term as possible, we wanted to give that flexibility, but with the understanding that that flexibility is not a blank check. There are goals and objectives in the Affordable Housing Master Plan related to senior housing, permanent supportive housing, deeper levels of affordability that really signal already adopted standards that this community is looking for.
Thank you, Mr. Rogers, and I appreciate that and fully understand the need for flexibility. I'll be quick here, noting the hour. I guess two things. I'll certainly associate myself with some of my colleagues' previous remarks about wanting some better guidelines and being a little sad that we're not kind of doing these in the reverse order, but understanding where we are. We'll say that, as you know, Mr. Rogers, there will be many instances where a project may come forward with 50% committed affordable for very good reasons. And our county board, I think, has different motivations, candidly, about what they would want to support, and for also very good reasons. I think, if given the opportunity to expand affordable housing, and particularly at lower, AMI, they would want to do that. And I think there's very good reasons to do that. I think we just need to be clear about what this language is. And I think one of the things that struck me is staff's emphasis on this 100% committed affordable. And then, buried in the text, it's, well, actually, there's this huge caveat. And so I would encourage staff to be very honest about what this is. Something could come forward with 30% committed units, and the board could adopt that, and it could still have additional height. So I'm going to be supporting this. With all that being said, I think this is a good approach, but I would, and we need the flexibility, but I would like staff to be kind of more honest about what's happening and what can happen in communities in the county, and not say that it has to be 100%. Mm-hmm. And I'm looking forward to that conversation later on the other study, and encourage you and your colleagues to talk to me as LRPC chair as the time becomes appropriate. Thank you, Mr. Rogers.
Thank you.
Commissioner Steinberger.
Sorry, I wasn't fast enough. So, and again, we're talking about sort of this section, we're considering some of the recommendations from the Lee Highway Alliance. Is that correct?
Yeah, we're talking about the concerns that were raised by the Plan Lee Highway process. That community process is going on.
Okay, so the one that really spoke to me is the fact that if we're looking at what planning documents we already have in place, that really we should be considering planning documents that are sort of in process or going to be in place. And I really do think that the language should be considering or inclusive of, rather, pending planning, county planning documents, whatever they may be. So that's a modification that I would be interested in hearing if there's other support for, and really a motion that I think that I would be making. That was really all I wanted to say specifically on the Lee Highway Alliance considerations. And I'm not sure I really need a response to that from Mr. Rogers, but I appreciate that you went on video and we're ready to respond. If you have a response, happy to hear it, but I don't need one. Thank you.
Yeah, I'd like to associate myself with the Commissioner Steinberger and Commissioner Schroll. Lee Highway Alliance President Pam Gillen raised, I think, a very important point, which ties into what they were saying, is that by having that loophole, which effectively it is, that we're really not talking about 100%. The developer could come in and propose something that's 30% affordable and the rest for good reason, and there'd be compelling reasons to do it. This is why the Highway Alliance is so concerned, and the communities along the corridor are concerned about this, because it is frankly a loophole, and it is something that we're working very hard with. The Plan Lee Highway process is very much going to be addressing this, but this could cause a site to go ahead and develop contrary to what we are working on, the county is working on. This is a county process to replan Lee Highway. It's supposed to be wrapped up in 2022, a year from now. And this is sort of almost putting the cart before the horse on something that will in fact be effectively an area plan that would then preempt. But meanwhile, something could come in tomorrow and preempt the preemption. This is why there is such concern with the Plan Lee Highway process and how these two things interface. Anyway, Commissioner Siegel, you have some comments?
Yes, I support your comments, and I want to add to it, just having been aware of the long-term angst on the part of the Lee Highway community about when they would get planned. I mean, I don't know what it is now, 7 years. Commissioner Lantelmi may know how long that took, and the blood, sweat, and tears that went into it. So I'm sort of sensitive to that. But from a slightly different perspective, I know that I was involved in some of the early studies. There was an issue of nodes and nodes and communities around the nodes as a way of developing a coherent area while preserving affordable housing and preserving market rate and other related policies. So I just have I think a very quick question. What trumps what? You've got two policies for Mr. Rogers, of course, this question is, what trumps what? I can't think of another plan off the top of my head, but case one, you have a plan that has certain building massing guidelines, let's say. if there is a conflict with this policy, what trumps what? I mean, is there a simple answer to that? I'm sort of hoping there is. I guess there isn't.
Yeah. Commissioner Siegel, if I can reframe your question, I think quite bluntly, you're saying if there is an area, let's use our common vernacular, an area sector plan that governs a defined geography versus a more, let's say, the multifamily reinvestment study, a more county-wide principle that is not defined by a specific geography other than the zoning of the site. I'll defer to other colleagues who may want to chime in, but I have to think that particularly in a discretionary review like a site plan or a use permit, where one of the findings that the board is making is conformance to the comprehensive plan, we're looking at that area and sector plan as something that is supporting our comprehensive plan. We're looking we're giving primacy to what's in the defined geography.
Okay. Then the next question regarding Lee Highway, as you know, is can you, I mean, frankly, there's a motion in my head, can you defer final action for those sites owned RA 14, et cetera, those three zoning districts until the Lee Highway plan is adopted? Is that a possibility? I mean, how much angst and headache does that cause staff, something of that nature?
It causes a lot of angst and complexity with an already very narrowly tailored text amendment. And so just a reminder for you and your colleagues, the proposed building height increase provision would only be enabled in 3 zoning districts for either a 100% affordable project or a significantly affordable project that gets through the site plan process with effective transitions that's outside of a planned area. So we feel the language is very narrow right now. The types of projects that would satisfy those numerous checklist items, we are not aware of a project that would fit all of those checklist items that's coming along Lee Highway. We don't think there's going to be one because of the lead up, because of the advanced time that I talked about before in order to pull together the very complex financial tools, the property acquisition, all of the different plans and by plans, I mean development proposals that go into an affordable housing project. Essentially, if someone was going to do that on Lee Highway, they've been very careful to not show their cards to anyone in the community, or else we just see it as highly unlikely. And the added complexity that would come with an already very complex, very narrow text amendment, it calls into question some concerns that we would have to raise with the county attorney's office on good zoning practice.
I just know that Lee Highway continues to ask for that because it is not planned. So when you look at the legal language on the face of it, the lawyers we have several of them on the commission can weigh in, but it is not planned. It is unplanned right now. It is unplanned. And I think they want, because they're so close, they think they're close, and the Lee Highway has been deferred for good. I'm still quite, I feel their pain. And so I hear what you're saying. I might be convinced myself, but I know what they've been through.
Yeah, and I appreciate you stating that, Commissioner Siegel, and I hope in our presentation and in the conversations we've had with you tonight, I'm speaking on behalf of my entire agency, and we understand that anxiety. We're not, while we've made attempts to reassure, we understand it, and we're not, we're keeping the door open, and we're keeping the conversations going, and we're not trying to be dismissive because of the hard work that the community has done, because they're right near the finish line. I hope that we have not come across as obtuse and uncaring. We understand and we sympathize.
You have not, but they have been through a lot. Anyway, thank you so much. Thank you.
Okay, I think it's now time. Commissioner Patel, do you have a motion or motion to offer?
I do. Let's see. Okay, so I move that the Planning Commission recommend that the county board amend, reenact, or recodify Articles 12 and 15 of the Arlington County Zoning Ordinance to allow modifications of the maximum building height of up to 60 feet for multifamily residential development in the RA 14-26, RA 8-18, and RA 6-15 districts by the county board through its site plan approval authority for development projects, providing 100% of the dwelling units as low or moderate income housing, and make other editorial changes to improve clarity as shown in attachment 1. Sorry, everyone.
It's okay. Do we have a second? Do we have a second?
This is Tenley. I'll second.
Okay, thank you, Commissioner Peterson. Throwing it open to discussion. Okay, hearing nothing. Yes, Commissioner Morton.
Thank you. I would like to make a motion. Is this the right time to do it?
Yes.
Okay. So I move that the Planning Commission recommend that the county board direct staff to prepare additional standalone advisory guidance for use during SPRC discussions, elaborating on the various qualities that can contribute to a successful context-specific transition to surrounding neighborhoods.
Second.
Okay, that was Commissioner Gillen seconding. Okay. Would you like to speak to your motion, Commissioner Morton?
I think I and others have spoken to it. Quickly, I just feel this might ensure a better chance of success. I don't want this to be seen as design versus housing. I believe it could provide perhaps more acceptance from the community because of the predictability, maybe better upfront guidance to applicants, and improved discussion, since this will be done during SPRC. I also think you could argue that this would be a more transparent and potentially equitable addition because all neighborhoods would be treated equally and have the benefit of discussing things with the same framework. Thanks.
Thank you. Commissioner Hughes.
Thanks, Commissioner Lantomi. I generally support the intent and message behind it, Commissioner Morton, but I don't intend to support it only in the aspect of I do think that it's still in the wishy-washy category of guidelines, and the reality of it is staff needs to look more carefully at these areas in the multifamily residential areas and define what is acceptable, as you said, on a uniform and equitable basis. And I believe that the only way we will actually achieve that is through true prescriptive measures that are similar and equitable similar to a by right process. And so I don't really want to distract staff from those efforts. And so it's with that reason I will not be supporting it.
Thank you, Commissioner Hughes. Commissioner Weir.
I expect that I'll support this. I do have some concerns. I am concerned about any sort of guidelines or guidance or checklist. While I really do like checklists insofar as I think that they can make sure that we don't forget things and can make discussions more efficient, I worry about adding guidance or guidelines that would apply to SPRC projects in certain areas and would not apply to SPRC projects in other areas. And I worry that doing so opens the floodgates to additional such ad hoc guidance where highly esoteric isn't the right word, but highly contextualized issues arise. And you know, my other point earlier this evening still, I'm becoming increasingly worried every time I hear someone talk about guidance for making sure that projects transition to the single family neighborhoods, because we understand, there is a near global consensus among urbanists that the suburban development pattern is either one or two steps away from being the primary cause of the climate crisis, and so we've got to do everything we can to encourage ourselves to think other than the primacy of the single family neighborhood. So I will support it, but I wanted to share my reservations with respect to precedent and the comments I'd made earlier. Thank you.
Thank you, Commissioner Ware. Commissioner Siegel?
I'm a little uncomfortable with the proposed amendment, which is not to say that I don't want to thank, and I do thank Commissioner Morton for raising the issue for the discussion in the way she did. I really do thank you for that. My concern is that I think staff has heard this, and in my back and forth with Mr. Rogers, we don't know what will come out of their staff's presentation to an LRPC ZOCO meeting. I mean, we're going to get that. So I'm not sure what we add by making a motion to have the board direct staff to do what I think they are. They've taken on board a lot of what we said. What I think they're in the process of doing it. So with all due respect, I think I can't. I'm not sure I can support the motion, and perhaps I'll abstain, but for those reasons. But thank you, Commissioner Morton, for raising the issue. I appreciate it.
Commissioner Gillen.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I will be supporting this motion. I think it addresses a lot of the concerns many of us have raised tonight. And I support it because I'd like to see us use this uniformly in other SPRCs and LRPCs. Many of you know we face this all the time in Crystal City. What is an architectural feature? So I hope that this is a good opportunity for us to underscore how important it is to get this sort of guidance to help our own discussions, since that's part of our obligation to find that fit between the proposal and the community. Thank you.
Thank you, Commissioner Gillen. I will associate myself with those comments because I will be voting for the Commissioner Morton's motion for those reasons. Commissioner Steinberger and then Commissioner Patel.
Commissioner Steinberger, but I realized that I may be out of, or I think I jumped the gun. I have an amendment that I'm also going to propose, but I think we need to address this before I can do any of that. So apologies.
Okay, Commissioner Patel.
Thank you. I had initially considered supporting Commissioner Morton's motion, and I don't know if I'm too far away from it, but I think Commissioner Siegel's comments have led me to think a little bit further about this. The other problem is I'm actually kind of confused by the language of the motion, because I do agree with the first part of it, meaning that I do agree that we should prepare some additional standalone advisory guidance for use during the SPRC discussions. I do believe that the conversations today for the last 2 hours and 45 minutes or 2 hours and 30 minutes have really spoken to the issue of creating these guiding principles for us. The part that I don't understand necessarily is how using these big principles can contribute to a successful kind of context specific transition. And I just want to be careful how we're using the terms equity and equality, because while I believe that there needs to be a framework for all of these discussions and each specific project, I think that there needs to be some flexibility, which is, I guess, a hallmark tenet of equity, right? And to make sure that we are allowing for each project to be able to serve that particular community in the most functional way possible. So I'm just kind of, I'm mixed up a little bit around the language, and I'm sure that frustrates many of my colleagues, since I'm always mixed up about some of the language. I don't know how to fix this just quite yet. I just wanted to make the point known that these 2 points, the bigger issue, guiding principles, yes. To successful context-specific transition, I don't understand that. Thank you.
Okay, and Commissioner Morton, last comment.
Thank you. I know we're short on time. Just to clarify, what I could envision is during SPRC, just incorporating into a staff report, here are 5 possible characteristics that could characterize a sensitive transition. The reason for context-based is I'm very sympathetic with staff's analysis that every site might be different. You might say a big buffer is necessary, but that's not possible or even desirable sometimes. So my language of context-specific, I can think of 5 or 6 off the top of my head that you could list, and maybe the project would meet 3 or 4 of them, but it would just allow us to have a common way to discuss. So that was my intent. Thanks.
Thank you. I think what I'd like to do now is move on to vote for Commissioner Morton's motion, and then we would move on to the main motion. I'll start going down the list here. Commissioner Weir?
Aye.
Commissioner Siegel?
I'm going to abstain on this.
Commissioner Schroll? Commissioner Schroll, you're on mute.
Aye.
Commissioner Hughes?
No.
Commissioner Guerin?
Aye.
Commissioner Morton?
Aye.
Commissioner Patel?
I too am going to abstain.
Commissioner Steinberger?
Abstain.
Commissioner Bagley?
Abstain.
Commissioner Peterson?
Aye.
Commissioner Sarli?
Aye.
And I will vote aye as well. Passes 7-1 with 4 abstentions. We now move on to the main motion. Is there any final discussion on that? I note that I will be voting against the main motion, and not because I don't support the concepts here. And again, Mr. Rogers has did a great job on describing why they're moving ahead on this. I'm just continue to be concerned that there's really, to my mind, there's not a satisfactory solution at this point for squaring the circle with the interface between this proposal and the Planned Lee Highway effort going forward by the county right now. What I hope to do is simply highlight that that is something that the county has made many promises to Lee Highway to get that planning effort done. I would hope that this would spur that process be completed on time with no further delays. Then that means being wrapped up in I hope early 2022, so that the concerns of the community will be put to rest, and that as Mr. Rogers says, there would be no projects being raised under this current change to the ordinance. Anyway, comment, Commissioner Weir, Steinberger, and Hughes. Commissioner Weir first.
I was bad.
Okay. Commissioner Steinberger.
So I still want to make a motion, although perhaps Commissioner Lantelmi's most recent statement indicates to me why I'm really struggling with how to make the motion I want to make, because I'm not really sure where to put the language. But I do think that the motion should exempt areas of the county where there are pending planning policies at this time or underway, And I'm not sure really where to put that in the language of the motion.
So Commissioner Steinberger, this is Commissioner Hughes. Would you mind, before you try to make a motion, or Commissioner Lantomi to follow up, would there be interest? The reason the RA limits that I put forward, the RA 6 through 15 limit within it, if you saw in your email earlier, would effectively allow the one project that we've heard this evening that's very interested in moving forward or to proceed, while limiting the areas of potential opportunities for this to be used. In other words, it would even neck it down one level further. And if Mr. Rogers would be so kind as to pull up his map, it would allow you to see exactly where it would be. So again, it would be anything that's in an HCD outside of a major planned district that's RA 6 through 15. Would that alleviate your concerns and possibly gain your support? That would be my question to Commissioner Steinberger and Commissioner Lantomi, because if so, then I'd put forward the motion and we'll just see how it goes.
Well, I like the part where it gets me out of having to craft this language in a way that I can't come up with. So yeah.
Yeah, it doesn't do it for me. I'm doing this more as a protest vote.
Hey, I hear that, Commissioner.
I'm following Commissioner Hughes' lead on this one.
Yeah, it's weird for you guys to be on opposite sides of the argument on that particular point, but okay.
So Commissioner Steinberger, I don't think it's necessary to make the motion this evening. It's now for the public record, both yours and my opportunities, and I think the board notes this will continue to go forward, and the opportunity still lies there for them to consider such a limiting language, which would be, again, to just further neck it down to just RA 6 through 15. So if you wanted to do it, all you need to do is just restrict it to RA 6 through 15.
Okay, do you want me to do it, or were you going to make the motion?
If you do it, I'll second it, but I'm not going to make it this evening because I am willing to allow the flexibility even further than that, but I'm willing to support its limiting as well.
Okay, then Commissioner Lantomi, can I make that motion?
Yes, you may.
So to amend the motion before the board so that the Planning Commission recommends adopting the attached ordinance to amend reenact 15 of the Arlington County zoning ordinance to allow modification to the maximum building height of up to 60 feet for multifamily residential development in the RA 6 to 15 districts by the county board through its site plan approval authority for development projects providing 100% of the dwelling units as low or moderate income housing, and to make other editorial changes to improve clarity as shown in attachment 1.
Second.
Okay, it's moved and seconded. Commissioner Rhee, you have a comment on that?
Yeah, I will be opposing this proposed amendment. I want to direct people's attention to the brownish RA 615 areas and just make sure that people note that nearly all of them exist within an existing planning district. The ones that don't exist within an existing planning district are either basically River Place or the Crystal Houses or along Lee Highway, and will therefore be in a planning district. So this, because it basically restricts this, because this amendment would basically restrict its impact to a few sites in and around the Roslyn area. I think that it's, Commissioner Steinberger, I don't think it's your intent to offer an amendment that would basically be a poison pill, but I think that it would render such an amendment would render this zoning ordinance amendment basically useless. So I'll be opposing the motion to further amend.
Okay, thank you, Commissioner Weir. Commissioner Hughes, is your hand just still up, or did you have a comment? Okay, let's move ahead then with the vote on Commissioner Steinberger's motion. Commissioner Weir.
Sorry, before that, can I respond to Commissioner Weir's comments?
Sure.
I appreciate that this is potentially more limiting language than I might have otherwise sought. However, I feel that the commission is being asked to rush a decision for the purposes, understandably, of meeting funding timelines and a funding cycle for a project to move forward. this amendment would allow the project in question to move forward and allow for consideration of all other aspects of the program, which I think is really what we're hearing is from the commission tonight, is that there's not necessarily a lot of support for everything that this change would do over time, but that we understand there are valid reasons to make the change now to allow certain opportunities to go forward, specifically the one project that we keep hearing about. So from my perspective, yes, this may be a bit more limiting, but I'm not necessarily hearing an overwhelming amount of support across the board from the commission that that the language as written gets us to where we want to go in sort of an equally in a satisfactory manner. So I think there's some trade-offs here, but I just wanted to make that point. Thank you.
Thank you, Commissioner Steinberger. I think we have to move ahead to a vote now. Commissioner Weir.
Nay.
Commissioner Siegel.
No.
Commissioner Troll.
No.
Commissioner Hughes.
Aye.
Commissioner Guerin.
Nay.
Commissioner Morton.
Nay.
Commissioner Patel.
Nay.
Commissioner Steinberger.
Aye.
Commissioner Bagley.
Abstain.
Commissioner Peterson.
Nay.
Commissioner Sarley.
Aye.
And I'll vote aye also. The motion fails. 4 ayes, 7 noes, and 1 abstention. On to the main motion.
As
Take
amended.
a vote on that as amended. By Commissioner Morton's motion. Commissioner Weir.
Aye.
Commissioner Siegel.
Aye.
Commissioner Schroll.
Aye.
Commissioner Hughes.
Aye.
Commissioner Guerin.
Aye.
Commissioner Morton.
Aye.
Commissioner Patel.
Aye.
Commissioner Steinberger.
Abstain.
Commissioner Bagley.
Abstain.
Commissioner Peterson.
Aye.
Commissioner Sarley.
Aye.
And I will vote nay, as I mentioned before. Thank you, Mr. Rogers. It's been a long evening. You've been very helpful to this very robust discussion. Anyway, thank you very much, and we'll move on to our next item. Madam Clerk, can you please call the final item?
Sure. Our final item for the evening is Z-2625-21-1-HD for historic designation. This is on the Fabre Lothrop Estate. We have Cynthia LaChase Torres and Lauren Ferris to present this item.
Welcome, Ms. Chess Torres. It's all yours.
Thank you, Madam Clerk, and thank you, Mr. Chairman, members of the Commission. Good evening. Please allow me a minute to pull up my presentation. Can you let me know when you see my cover slide?
It's up. It's up.
Wonderful. Thank you. So good evening, all. Given the late hour, I will plan to go through my presentation rather quickly. The focus of my conversation this evening really is on the designation process and what has happened to date. And I do want to make sure that we leave some time at the end for questions that the Commission might have. We do have several staff here waiting in the wings from both CPHD as well as DPR in case there are specific questions that you have. So with that, this request for consideration of the Fabre Lothrop Estate as a local historic district was initiated last April when an Arlington resident filed a designation application form with the county. Staff has 45 days upon receipt of an application to review it, and we deemed it complete in June of last year. As per section 11.3.4 of the county zoning ordinance, Staff must then notify the property owner of the application within 30 days of deeming it complete, and so that occurred last July. And since that time, staff and the Historical Affairs and Landmark Review Board Chairman have been closely communicating with an owner's representative on the next steps in this process. And to date, I'll point out that the HLRB has held 2 virtual public hearings to consider this request, the first in November of last year and the second in January of this year. And then lastly, the county board did approve a request to advertise in February. At the preliminary public hearing last November, the HLRB considered the merits of the application based on the information provided in the form and then heard public testimony. They then directed staff to complete the 3 tasks you see here: to undertake analysis and research of the buildings and grounds, to make findings of significance and determine which designation criteria were applicable, and then lastly, to return to the HLRB first within 3 months and then with our full findings in 6 months, which would have been in May of 2021. However, in December and January, the property owners filed for county permits to demolish all the buildings on the property. This prompted the HLRB chairman to expedite consideration of the request at the next scheduled HLRB hearing, which was on January 27th. At this meeting, the HLRB made 3 important findings. 1, they determined that the property was at substantial risk of being damaged or destroyed and decided to move expeditiously to protect the threatened resources. The HLRB found that the homes and structures met 8 of the 11 designation criteria that are in the ordinance. And then lastly, the board recommended that a total of 4 lots be considered for designation as an overlay. And lastly, they asked the county board to act as expeditiously as possible, considering that the resources are threatened. This slide here shows a map of the HLRB's recommended local historic district boundaries, shown in blue. It is comprised of the property's 4 main parcels that include the front drive and lawn area, the main house there in the middle, and then the associated outbuildings to the rear. I'll mention that the total estate is comprised of 15 separate parcels, the four parcels you see in blue, and then 11 paper lots that are located here along North Madison Street that were subdivided in 1951, but not built upon. A few additional things to keep in mind. Since this designation request has been expedited, our preservation staff has been unable to complete our thorough level of analysis that we typically undertake. The historic preservation staff requested permission multiple times from the owners to receive access to the property ever since the November HLRB hearing to document and study the buildings. We finally received limited access on March 24th, immediately prior to the demolition of the buildings. And that demolition work continues, I understand. We did not have sufficient time to carefully study each building as normally would be done. However, we did receive a tour of the estate from the trustees, and we were able to photograph the exteriors and interiors of each building. Although a significant amount of research exists about this property and its inhabitants over time, we have only been able to conduct a very limited amount of additional research. We also have not prepared our usual designation report, which typically includes physical descriptions of all the buildings on the site, statements of historic, architectural, and/or cultural significance, a full assessment of the zoning criteria, as well as the preparation of draft design guidelines. And what makes this particular designation a little more unusual too, the demolition permits have been approved and they were issued, and the buildings have all been partially demolished as of March 24th. And now that the county board has approved the request to advertise, there are these 2 additional public hearings that must take place. Tonight's Planning Commission hearing. Input from this commission is required because approval of a designation would create a zoning overlay. And as per the zoning ordinance, the Planning Commission must review such overlays. And then lastly, following tonight's hearing, the designation request will return to the county board for final consideration. That final step will occur on either April 17th or April 20th. And at that public hearing, the county board will decide whether or not to approve the designation request. For your reference, we've included a few representative images of the subject property. These photos were all taken by the Historic Preservation staff on our visit on March 24th, just prior to demolition. Shown on this slide is the main house that was expanded in 1898 during the ownership of Alvin Lothrop. The dwelling was designed in a heightened version of the colonial revival style, which made it quite rare for the county. The photos at the bottom on the left and the right show some of the rear wing of the main house, believed to have been part of the original 1859 house that had been built by John Febrey. On our site visit, in addition to the main house, we toured all the outbuildings. Here are two photos of the domestic outbuilding / office that was located immediately behind the main house. This building was constructed around 1900, again during the ownership of Alvin Lothrop. It was connected to the rear of the main house by the covered walkway that you can see in the bottom right-hand corner. The most recent owner, Mr. Randolph Rouse, used the second level of this building as his office. The building is designed in the Craftsman style and may have once been a secondary dwelling. Behind the previous building, there is a domestic outbuilding known as the caretaker's cottage. The photo on the left shows the front and left sides, and the right-hand image shows the rear and the right sides. We believe that the caretaker's house was constructed around 1860. The building had a fieldstone foundation, which you can see in the bottom right-hand photograph, that was similar to the fieldstone foundation of the 1859 portion of the main house. The building was flanked to the north and south by additions constructed around 1910, which gave the house more of a bungalow-type form. Around 1920, there was a long chicken coop attached to the east elevation, but it was either demolished or deteriorated, as it was noted to be in very poor condition in a 2009 architectural survey of the property. At the far end of the property, closest to the rear gate off North McKinley, was the barn and tower outbuilding. This structure was used most recently as a garage, and our research suggests that this structure was built around 1898 during the Lothrop ownership, and that it was specifically designed by architect Victor Mindeleff, who also designed the expansion of the main house. Most of the structure was set on a solid coarse stone foundation, approximately 20 inches thick. The most striking feature of this structure was the 8-sided tower, which was probably used as a water tower. This tower, along with the hipped roof dormers and wood shingle cladding, are products of Mindeleff's experiences as a working architect for the U.S. Life-Saving Service, which was the predecessor to the U.S. Coast Guard. And last but not least, here's a view of the in-ground swimming pool located east of the main house. This was constructed in 1934 and had a below-grade bathhouse. To be eligible for local designation, properties must meet at least 2 of 11 designation criteria that are detailed in section 11.3.4 of the zoning ordinance. After our site visit, the preservation staff reevaluated the criteria and determined that now only 3 of the criteria are applicable to this property. These are outlined here, criteria B, D, and J. I won't read them all to you, but essentially under criterion B, the property is significant for its agricultural history, as well as its transition from an upper class farm to a country estate, as well as for wartime use during the Civil War. Under criterion D, it is associated with locally significant persons, including the Febrey, Ball, Lothrop, and Rouse families. In 1898, the property was owned by Alvin Mason Lothrop, who was co-founder of the DC department store chain of Woodward and Lothrop. In 1951, Randolph Rouse purchased the estate. He was a real estate developer and ended up being the longest owner of the property. However, in addition to these prominent residents, our research suggests that there were possibly several enslaved people, mostly young adults and children, who were forced to live on the property and work as either domestic servants or farm laborers. After the Civil War, about 15 African Americans and/or non-white people continued to work in those same roles for the Febrey family. So not only the contributions of the prominent families are important here, but also those of the enslaved to help us have a more comprehensive understanding of county history. And lastly, criterion J, which deals with the potential to yield information, otherwise known as archaeology. Based on our research, there is the potential for intact archaeological resources from the mid-19th century related to the agricultural history of the site, as well as encampments of both Union and Confederate troops during the Civil War. Since the estate has seen little development over time, there is also the possibility of artifacts from pre-European occupation. However, this archaeological potential remains only speculative, given that an archaeological survey has never been completed on the property. So in conclusion, staff has two recommendations. The first would be to deny the proposed designation request as recommended by the HLRB. There is no longer sufficient basis by which to recommend designation, given the lack of physical buildings and actual archaeological evidence. Currently, Arlington County has 41 local historic districts, each of which features tangible physical attributes that convey that specific property's importance, whether they are buildings, cemeteries, Civil War forts, or other structures. Due to the demolition of the historic buildings on the February-Lothrop estate, the property is no longer able to convey its relevant areas of significance. And secondly, it is recommended that the county board direct the county manager to have staff develop a scope of work and a timeline for a potential planning study of the entire estate to help support goals and objectives of both the county's historic preservation master plan and affordable housing master plan. If so directed, staff would return to the county board by October with the preliminary scope of work and estimated project schedule. Such a study might consider historic preservation items like archaeological investigations and/or historic interpretation, and housing-related objectives such as increasing housing supply. At that time, the county board would decide whether staff should undertake this type of study. I'll close with mentioning that a process for updating the county's historic preservation master plan is now underway. To help guide the vision for historic preservation for the next decade, there will be various opportunities for public input on various topics. Our planning effort will study existing historic preservation tools and processes, and also will explore new tools, incentives, and overall goals. To that end, our staff and our consultant team will closely examine the local designation process and assess opportunities for procedural improvements using the designation request for the February-Lothrop estate as a case study. So this includes our staff presentation, and like I said, there are several staff available to help answer your specific questions. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Madam Clerk, do we have any public commenters?
We do not, but we do have a representative to speak at the time under commissions and committees on behalf of the estate and the trustees.
Yes. Mr. Colucci, are you available to talk?
Yes. Can you hear me?
Yes, we can.
All right. So I'm Tom Colucci. I'm with the law firm of Walsh, Colucci, Lubelai, and Walsh, and we represent the owners of the property. And I guess the troubling thing from the owner's perspective is this whole process was initiated by a single individual. And no matter how well-meaning it may be, or he may be, or the group may be that's trying to do this, they have no economic interest in the property. And the effect of what was attempting to be done was to destroy the value of the property. If you look at the size of the designation, it was about 7.5 acres out of about 9.5 acres. And the purpose of having that large an area was to add context to the buildings. Well, the buildings are no longer there, so there really is no context to add. However, it was really the position of the owner that this was really almost a de facto taking of the property, in as much as the owner was attempting to market the property, and this really put a monkey wrench into that effort. In fact, several people who were very interested in purchasing the property dropped their contracts as a result of the activity that was going on. So in any event, the owner has consistently been opposed to any sort of designation or overlay on the property, and I guess we will leave it at that. You've had a long night, and so we support the staff recommendation to deny the overlay.
Thank you, Mr. Colucci. Do we have any commissions here?
Yes, I'm here, Dick Woodruff, representing the Historic Affairs and Landmark Review Board.
Okay, thank you. Go ahead.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman and members of the Planning Commission. I'm going to weigh in on the county manager's recommendation, which is what is the county manager's recommendation I think you have under review. But first, I'd like to give you some of the backstory and how we've gotten to where we are on this. You know, as Ms. Lucchesi-Torres said, and let me also state for the record, I want to commend our historic preservation staff who've worked incredibly hard on this and many other areas to protect Arlington's increasingly fraught historic legacy. As she mentioned, we received a petition last year to protect the property with an historic overlay. When that happened, I had hoped that we and the county and the owners might come to some agreement that would allow for protection of the main house and the grand entrance from Wilson Boulevard, which is a very distinctive site that Arlingtonians have known and seen for many, many years. And I thought that that could be done while allowing for whatever subsequent development might occur on the property. Having an historic overlay would not prevent development of most of the property. The owners were against that. And as you heard from Mr. Colucci, they thought it would interfere with the sale. I don't necessarily believe that's the case. Even so, they've expressed they have no desire to retain any interest in the property after the sale. It's a mystery to me why they were so hell-bent on destroying the buildings. So when they moved to demolish the buildings, HLRB recommended in January, as Ms. Lucchesi-Torres said, and pursuant to the ordinance, that the county board protect them with an historic overlay. And the HLRB found the property had substantial historic value. In February, as you know, the county board acted unanimously to advertise the hearings on the HLRB's recommendations to take place in April, 2 months hence, despite everyone's understanding that the owners would demolish the buildings as soon as they had the requisite permits in hand. Permits which the county attorney had informed the board were administrative in nature and couldn't be blocked without fear of a lawsuit. That was in February. In March, the owners got their permits, and last week they demolished the buildings. And as I understand it, they are practically completely demolished. The main house, the caretaker's house, the garage, its tower, pump house, the greenhouse, all the historic structures are gone. And if that wasn't bad enough, the county until the morning of the demolition, and they had 20 minutes to take pictures. And I want to commend Ms. Lucchesi-Torres for putting the best face on what was really a bad situation. The bulldozers moved in even before they left the premises, and they were really unable to fully document in any significant way, in any normal way that you would in a historic preservation sense, of a building that was about to be demolished. And I believe this was a failure of the county leadership. They failed to facilitate a proper effort to remember these buildings. Ultimately, there was no salvage. Inlaid floors, columns, windows, an entire office of intact mid-century furniture and more wound up in a pile to be hauled off to the dump. The whole thing was such a needless waste. and could have been avoided, it's really inexplicable. And it usually doesn't happen this way. DC or Alexandria, older buildings, even when they're knocked down, they get salvaged and documented. The government leaders there insist on it. Compare that to what's going on in Fairfax County to protect the historic River House property. The property owners there are also opposed to preservation, but the county leadership recognizes the property has important public value and is willing to fight for it. Regarding the county manager's recommendation number 1 to deny the historic designation for the property, it's a foregone conclusion because of their previous lack of urgency and interest. They've facilitated its destruction. Regarding the second recommendation, I support the study. Hopefully something good will come of it. I support the idea that Ms. Lachese Torres has of perhaps forming a partnership with a university to do some archaeological work, so we'll eventually have some understanding of anything that may be underground there in conjunction with whatever development takes place. But the one thing that you should know is that, and maybe you already know this property is zoned R6, and it is fully enabled to be single family home developed without interference by the county. And that historic overlay was really one of the only ways the counties had to control the future development of that property. So it's really unfortunate from that standpoint. That's not my bailiwick. Mine was the importance of the historic buildings, which were very significant. And it's unfortunate they're gone. With that, I just want to thank you for the opportunity to speak, and hope that something eventually comes good out of all of this. Thank you.
Okay. Thank you very much. The item is now before the commission. Do we have any questions or comments? Yes, Commissioner Steinberger.
Phew. Okay, so there's a lot to unpack here. So certainly I think, and I certainly appreciate the historic preservation staff and the HLRB for giving context to the written report that the Planning Commission received for this week. I think that there were, judging by the number of questions I sort of received from other planning commissioners as to sort of what was going on, it met my understanding that there was a lot that had happened sort of behind the scenes, and that to sort of get to the point where this is the recommendation we're receiving and this is the circumstance we're in. Certainly tonight's information has confirmed that strong suspicion that I came into this item surmising. I think it is utterly unfortunate we are at this moment. And that is probably a milder take than words I might have otherwise used. I think that I have concerns, certainly, that the owner has taken a rather malevolent disregard to a process that really every other time I've seen it operate in Arlington has been one, even if there's some disagreement, there's been an opportunity for sort of a meeting of the minds and a coming to a reasonable accommodation and an opportunity to sort of have the best result. That certainly wasn't the approach that an army of bulldozers has on, the moment. I think that, in terms of sort of where to go from here, it doesn't seem that there's whatever could be preserved at this point in time. Building wise, well, that's a non-issue. I do still want to know what at this point could sort of be preserved from an archaeological study and what that might entail. And if the owner is willing to be decent at this point to allow something like that to move forward. I'm not really sure who those comments would be best positioned to address those comments. I suspect it's a mix of our preservation staff as well as the representative of the owners. Thank you.
Okay, I'd like to hold off on them answering to get all the questions from the commissioners first. Sure. Commissioner Morton and then Commissioner Bagley.
Thank you. I'd like to thank staff, as Mr. Woodruff did, for the research and uncovering not only, I think, what people knew about the property, but some of the stories behind the scenes. A small point, I'm wondering, looking at the photos, I was sort of surprised if we have any, I know this wasn't designated, but even for regular buildings, if there's a demolition by neglect provision in any of our ordinances. But I think, like in many cities, the loss of some cherished resource often provokes reform in the planning processes and policies. And as Ms. LaChase Torres noted, I was happy to see that this would be used as a case study in thinking about updating the historic preservation plan. I think being proactive about listing and strategies for what deserves listing in Arlington would be really fruitful. So preservationists are always accused of coming in at the last minute and deciding something's historic. So it's nice that this will be a case study. And also thinking about tools, I really think our financial tools and incentives are in need of updating. And so I was glad to hear Ms. LaChase Torres talking about that. Incentives, TDRs, rights of first refusal. There's all kind of potential tools that we have to avoid just trying to be a regulator. So that's it for me for now. Thanks.
Thank you, Commissioner Morton and Commissioner Bagley.
Yes, I align myself with both comments of Commissioner Steinberger and also Commissioner Morton. So this is a very sad state of affairs if, in fact, we do have a mission for historic preservation in this county. And if we don't, then we shouldn't be going through this. I do want to mention that there, and I appreciate also Commissioner Morton's comments. We do need to look at this process. It's a very small historic staff. They have a lengthy process. When somebody like Mr. Colucci's client finds out that, oh, gee, somebody has put in for a historic designation, their response is there's no economic interest, because usually the people that put these in have a historic interest. And it doesn't necessarily preclude that there won't be an economic interest. Where I think part of the system is falling apart is we're not fast enough to respond with some of the things that can show a client like Mr. Colucci's what maybe would be some alternatives. We'll never know now if any of the buildings in this area could have been used for other alternate purposes, alternate housing, alternate daycare, alternate schooling, alternate anything. We won't know. Having been in a civic association role before this and having two applications come in asking for historic districts and World War IX breaking out, it is that the person who owns the land sees this as someone, as Mr. Colucci said, monkey wrench thrown in, contracts being dropped. I saw people that put in these requests in the past humiliated in public because they stepped forward to try to preserve something in the past. So I really think we need to really broaden this if we're serious about doing, not to say we have to save everything, not to say if buildings are falling apart for whatever reason, at whose fault, neglect, whatever, that we don't need to say, okay, yes, move forward. But if we are going to have this, we need to improve the process. We also need to, if there are things there that could have been repurposed, and I say this every time when there's a project that comes up, a little house that's going to be blown down, whatever, why do we just take it to the landfill? Why isn't it part of this process that we talk about? There were some architectural features of this place that you can go to some of these stores and they're charging a lot of money for them. I just think that this is an opportunity, sad as it is. Hopefully there will be some lemons made out of, or some lemonades made out of this lemon that, everybody can learn from. that we can make it better in the future. And my heart goes out to the preservation staff. This has got to be a very bitter pill to swallow. So I do hope something good comes out of this. Thank you.
Thank you, Commissioner Bagley. Commissioner.
So can you hear me now? Does staff have any responses to Commissioner Steinberger's questions?
Mr. Chairman, this is Cynthia.
Yes.
I wanted to make sure, are you asking for questions? Answers to questions? You cut off for a second.
Yeah, I know my earbuds ran out of juice. Yeah. Do you have any responses to Commissioner Steinberger did have some questions?
Sure.
Is there anything to address from what she said? Was that?
Sure. I'm happy to address Ms. Steinberger's comments. I think Commissioner Steinberger, your main question had to do with the potential for doing archaeology at the site. That is definitely, I think, something that would be of interest to the preservation staff if additional study could take place on this property. Given that it is private property, this is not something that the county could require of either the current owners or any future owners. This would need to be something that would be done in collaboration with the current and or future owners. Given the nature of historic preservation in this region and the fact that there are several colleges and universities that have very successful programs, including archaeological programs, my thought, as Mr. Woodruff had mentioned a few moments ago, if it was possible to arrange some type of partnership with one of those programs to recruit some students to do some archaeological investigations, maybe it's doing some very preliminary work, but anything like that would have to be done, of course, with permission of owners and with their willingness to do that. If the owners instead wish to, if during construction and groundwork activities, artifacts were discovered, they are not required to declare those or turn those over. If any of those wanted to be donated to the county, we would gladly, on behalf of the Historic Preservation Program, we would gladly make arrangements to collect those artifacts, so then we could work with professional archaeologists to do some interpretation there. But I think there's definitely potential, Ms. Steinberger, but there's really no requirement that we could impose to ensure that archaeology could occur. I don't know if you have any follow-up questions to that, or if Ms. Ferris, you wanted to add anything.
This is Commissioner Steinberger. No, I appreciate that. That more or less aligns with what I thought might be heard. I am interested in hearing from the owner's representative with regards to the same question, but certainly would be happy to hear from Ms. Ferris first. If that's no pressure, Ms. Ferris doesn't have to have anything to say. That wasn't already covered.
Commissioner Hughes.
Thanks. So I think there's a lot of lessons we should all think about as we proceed through this, and I just want to speak because Ms. Torres's comments remind us. You know, it's very aspirational to talk about these partnerships and things like that, but you know, as she alluded to, if they're undergoing land use activities to do an R6 development, they're not required to do very much unless it's a human remain. And archaeology exploration could cause the landowner to encumber issues should they find something that was unexpected. And this is the problem we have to think about as we approach this whole process of what is our ultimate goal with preservation and what is our ultimate goal and hopes for the site. This site is identified to my fellow commissioners within our GLUB as a generational site within the community. And that means fundamentally we need to think about whether we want to be the highest bidder as neighbors to ensure that the interest of the trustees, who's legally obliged to fiduciarily hold out for the best price, to ensure that this community is the one that owns that property at the end. This is Virginia by all accounts. We do not have the same powers and regulations as other places. So the only other options are personally, and I know politically untenable in this community, and so I don't even wish to mention them here. But what we must remember of is for our people listening is what we should be asking our board is, are we willing to be the biggest bidder on this site? And if we are, we need to put our money where our mouth is and get it, because this site is a generational site. And I will be the first commissioner. I will support the staff motions in all aspects, but let me put it down in plain as ink. No matter what the future use of the site is, this is generational, and we must be the highest bidder to get this site. And to thought that a contract was already on it to do an R6 zoning, which is fundamentally a single family development by right, I mind all my fellow commissioners, is untenable. And we should be asking the board and telling the board, this is generational. That means we need to put up the cash and get this site. And yes, it's going to be expensive, but yes, building a house in Arlington is an expensive endeavor. Ask all the private developers that do it. So I'll be quiet now, Commissioner Lantomi, but I felt it had to be said, because we can talk about all of these aspirational goals, but the bottom line is this is about dollars and cents, and the trustee has a fiduciary responsibility to maximize their return. And that's fair. And we need to be fair in return and ensure that we represent the best offer they receive.
Thank you, Commissioner Hughes. My only comment on this is that while it is, of course, too late for any of the structures, I drove by there this afternoon, and it's just a pile of sticks where the house was. Everything else is scraped. This is a large piece of land that R6 seems to be not the highest and best use. There are apartment buildings across the street in Fairfax. There's garden apartments to the south across Wilson in Arlington. A large piece of land. It could be a school, it could be a park, it could be multifamily housing. Single family R6 seems to be the least useful use for this property, and I'm definitely going to be support having a study being done of what would be best here. That said, are there any other commissioners who want to comment or question right now? Yes, Commissioner Steinberger.
Thank you. I still had questions. I wanted to hear from the owner's representative, and I don't feel that happened.
Yes, before I get to Commissioner Weir, Mr. Colucci, do you have any response to Commissioner Steinberger?
Yes. Whether or not the owner would permit any kind of archaeological study, I don't know. I am not the owner. That's something I could raise with the owner. Probably not likely. I think Mr. Hughes hit the nail on the head. The property is for sale. The trust that owns the property is a charitable trust. All the money that is derived from the sale of the property will go to charitable causes in the county. So they have a fiduciary duty to maximize what they get for the property, and then that then gets applied to charitable purposes. And then I guess the other thing is, and I think Mr. Hughes hit the nail on the head, the property has been for sale. The county could certainly buy it if it wants. The county could condemn it if it wants. But that would require that they, under the state and federal constitution, that they pay fair market value for the property. I think the efforts to designate the property or have it subject to an overlay district really was, in my view, an indirect method of trying to condemn the property without having to pay compensation for the property. So that's really been the owner's view on it. And to be honest with you, that's what caused the demolition of the improvements, although the improvements were all in very, very bad condition. So to some extent, they would have required an awful lot of money to restore.
Okay, thank you, Mr. Colucci. Commissioner Weir.
So I guess my question might be for staff. Assuming that what the assuming that what the owner wants to see happen is that it's sold to a builder or developer that will develop it by right under R6 zoning, which I am making that assumption because any denser zoning would have yielded a greater return to the charitable trust, and so I am inferring by outcome that is what the current estate and owner and trustees want. Is October 2021 is the initiation of a study in October 2021 really timely? Should there be commencement on the part of the owner or a purchaser to actually start in earnest developing the materials that it needs to submit for building the, I think I heard for parcelizing the units and turning that into a single family project? I guess what I'm asking is the county, per some perspectives, lost a race against the clock, and are we not just setting ourselves up to lose another race?
Hi.
Ms. Smith?
Hi, Commissioner Weir. Thanks for that question. I'll just jump in, and what we've been asked to, in response to your question, what we've been asked to do is to indicate when we could come back after giving more thought in terms of, what would a scope look like, what would we want to consider, what details of the Affordable Housing Master Plan or the Historic Preservation Master Plan, maybe other comprehensive plan goals for this site. And what we had indicated to the manager's office was that the soonest that we could come back for that was going to be October, and that would be or no later than October, and that would be with a scope and a potential timeline for that and what resources we would have to bring to bear for that. So it's not, at the moment, the proposal is not for an expectation that we would be undertaking that body of work between now and then to complete said planning study. Hope that clarifies.
Well, I think that you've hit on what I'm really getting at, which is that if we wouldn't be starting the study until October, and then the study has to get done, isn't that about the time that a purchaser for the land would need to have their by right, their papers in to develop it by right? So aren't we sort of just, to what extent is this a futile endeavor if we weren't going to start a study until October? Or maybe I misunderstood, Ms. Smith. I'm sorry if I did.
Well, again, I can't speak to the time frame for a potential owner. As I understand, again, that it's in trust ownership, so it's not this entity that would be preparing the development plans and proceeding with construction. And I can't speak to the timeline for when a sale may go through. And I mean, I think what we're indicating is, that, we would like the board to, reinforce this recommendation, but I think there needs to be some further internal discussion in terms of, is this fruitful? Meaning, how would we engage with a future property owner, to see if this is something that's worthwhile.
Thank you.
All right, thank you.
Okay, Ms. Steinberger, your hand is still up.
Yes, I had another question.
Okay.
Perhaps I'm misunderstanding to a point. The study, as I understood it, was to look at the historic preservation approach that we're taking as a county and using this as a case study. Is that what will be happening with the goal of having those parameters in place for October, or did I misunderstand?
Cynthia, you may want to just clarify on the
Sure.
historic preservation master plan process from what the second part of the recommendation is about.
Sure, Ms. Steinberger, to answer your question, our goal of using this designation as a case study is really to help us shape the historic preservation master plan update. We're going to be doing a really deep dive into our existing preservation tools, our incentives, our processes, and we want to know what's working really well and what's not working so well. And I think we can make some strong arguments in both camps. But because of the timing of this particular request, as the historic preservation master plan is in full swing for our update, we really felt it was important to study perhaps how this process could have gone differently. And so that is really our intention of using it as a case study, would be with the master plan update. Now, in terms of the planning study, as laid out in the second recommendation, if the county board directed the county manager to have staff work on such a study, I think we could look at various historic preservation goals and objectives. And I had mentioned them previously, whether or not there's a willingness to do any type of archaeology with any future owners, and then even absent or with archaeology, whether or not there would be an opportunity to do some historic interpretation, whether it's through county historic markers or other means. So there could be potential discussions along those lines, but the case study really was focused more for our master plan update, if that clarifies your question.
I think it does. I guess that makes sense to me. I'm struggling with sort of where that would fall into. I don't, to the extent that Commissioner Boyer was considering whether, what development might be proposed for this site itself, I'm not sure that as much in my understanding impacts at least the first part of the study, as you just described, as this being a case study for the historic preservation master plan. Would you agree with that? That sort of would be happening regardless of what ownership interest is taking over this property? Okay, so I just want to make sure that I was understanding that piece. Okay. Thank you. I think really at this point, mostly this entire situation is just sad to me, and I think that to have gotten to this point, it's disappointing. It feels unnecessary, and it certainly feels like any path forward does not necessarily immediately lend itself to all parties coming together in any sort of a meeting of the minds or positive direction. From my perspective, I would certainly encourage the owner's representative that at this point, it seems the least that the ownership interest could do would be to operate in good faith with regards to any possible archaeological study that could take place on the site, and see if, as Commissioner Bagley had previously said, lemonade can be made from lemon peels at this point. That will be my final comment. Thank you.
I thank Commissioner Steinberger. Do we have any further comments? If not, Commissioner Steinberger, do you have some motions to bring forward?
Okay, when I said my final comment, I wasn't including motions.
Okay, go ahead.
The Planning Commission recommends denial of the proposed local historic district designation of this portion of the Febreze-Lothrop Estate as recommended by the HALRB.
Second.
Commissioner Hughes seconding. Why don't we go ahead with the, okay.
Can I do the second motion as well?
Yeah, why don't we put the second motion out too? So
okay. The Planning Commission directs the county manager to have staff explore and report to the county board by October 2021 on a potential planning study and schedule of the site in support of furthering historic preservation master plan and affordable housing master plan goals and objectives.
Second.
Second. Oh.
Okay, very good. So we have, that was, who was the second, the first second? Is that Commissioner Hughes again?
I think it was Commissioner Hughes for both.
It was me.
Okay, do we have any final comments on this? the vote? Okay, why don't we move ahead with motion 1? That's the denial of the district. Commissioner Weir. You're on mute. We're voting. Commissioner Weir. I'll come back to him. Commissioner Siegel.
Aye. Aye.
Commissioner Schroll.
Aye.
Commissioner Hughes.
Aye.
Commissioner Gearing.
Aye.
Commissioner Morton.
Aye.
Commissioner Patel.
Aye.
Commissioner Steinberger.
Aye.
Commissioner Bagley.
Aye.
Commissioner Peterson.
Aye.
Commissioner Sarland.
Nay.
Nay. Okay. Commissioner, and I will vote aye as well. Commissioner Weir, you there?
Yeah, I'm back on. I vote aye.
Okay. It passes 11 in favor, 1 against. Moving on to passes the second motion. Commissioner Weir.
Aye.
Commissioner Siegel.
Aye.
Commissioner Schroll.
Aye.
Commissioner Hughes.
Aye.
Commissioner Gearing.
Aye.
Commissioner Morton.
Aye.
Commissioner Patel.
Aye.
Commissioner Steinberger.
Aye.
Commissioner Bagley.
Aye.
Commissioner Peterson.
Aye.
Commissioner Sarley.
Aye.
And I vote aye as well. It passes unanimously. Thank you very much. Thank you, Ms. Torres, and the rest of staff here at this very late hour. Thank you for sticking it out with us. We will be doing our staff reports and other reports tomorrow, as well as the minutes. We'll reconvene at Wednesday, 7 p.m. Thank you to the staff, applicants, and the members of the public for your consideration and definitely your patience. The items this evening will be going to the county board on the April 17th or 20th meetings, and Commissioner Schroll will be representing the Planning Commission at those hearings. Many staff labor to make this run smoothly. That includes Ms. Johnson, Ms. Joanne Harrison, SBR Supervisor Matt Pfeiffer, Jen Smith, and David Wood. Thank you for your technical advice, support, and assistance through this. This commission meeting is in recess until Wednesday. Good night, all.